team dance. Morning, everybody. Can I get everybody's attention? Thank you, and thanks, Angus, for the round of applause as well. Sorry, just anxious to get started. I know it's a nice time of year where people are getting to meet up and connect after a busy academic year, but I just want to grab everybody's attention so we can get started this morning. So just by way of introduction, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Helen Marr. I'm the VP for EDI here at the University of Galway, and we're really delighted to be hosting this seminar today with Clarissa DeSantis Humphreys, who's here on my left. So I will just briefly introduce the seminar and a brief, I suppose, background or outline of Clarissa's work to date, but I'm guessing by the number of people here today that a lot of people are actually very familiar with Clarissa's work. So really looking forward to the morning, and just by way of introduction, to thank colleagues here, particularly Becky Connolly, our Sexual Violence and Harassment Prevention and Response Coordinator, for all of the groundwork that you've done, and in addition to Niamh Gallagher, who says no there, but always make sure every detail is worked out in advance. So I suppose this morning our focus is on addressing sexual violence in higher education, looking at policy and practice. And Clarissa's outline is around providing practical guidance on how to address sexual violence and related forms of gender-based violence in a higher education setting. The method described is a trauma-informed and survivor-centred approach, whilst being intersectional and also requiring perpetrator accountability. So I won't say too much more about the seminar, because I know, Clarissa, you're going to talk us through it. Just to say that our aim is to go straight through for the first 2 hours and then have an early lunch break. I think you'll call that around 12:30, 1:45, depending on how the session is moving along at that point. An early lunch break, and then back into the afternoon session with the aim of finishing at 2:30, at which point we're going to launch the next phase of the Active Consent Programme with Dr. Padraig McNeela and the University President. So moving on, I suppose, to introduce Clarissa. Clarissa's background is as a practitioner, a trainer, and also, I think, now recognised in the field as a leading authority on addressing gender-based violence at universities. She was the first person to hold a dedicated role in this particular field and domain in the United Kingdom, and she has developed and delivered related courses in the UK, in Egypt, in Ireland, and in the United States. She's co-authored publications on addressing student sexual violence in higher education and co-editor of Stopping Gender-Based Violence in Higher Education, both of which I think are really valuable for us working in this space in higher education in the Irish context. So she was recognised for her work with students by Durham Students' Union. She was awarded Best Student Support in 2018, and also recognised with other awards at Durham University, including Durham Women Making a Difference on 2 occasions and Inspiring Women at Durham. So I think it's really good to see actually that validation of your work and your expertise and that recognition at university level, which suggests in itself, I suppose, that there is a support for the work that you're undertaking and that it's recognised and validated. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Clarissa to bring us through the session. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I don't normally get nervous until someone starts talking about me, so thanks for that. Good morning. Thank you so much for coming here today and being part of the seminar. Again, my name is Clarissa DeSantis Humphreys, and I'm delighted to be here. It is my first time in Ireland, my first time in Galway, and I am loving it, except there are a lot of Americans here, and that feels very weird. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've heard more American accents than Irish ones so far, so if you have an Irish accent, please ask questions. I need to hear your voice. Today's seminar is jam-packed with information, but the way that I've developed it today is I want to give you almost a whistle-stop tour of some key information. I very much hope that when you leave today's session, you take away practical information that you can go and use, but I also hope that you leave with more questions than you walked in with. And the reason why I want that to happen for you is because I want to pique your interest, and I want to help you identify gaps in areas that you want to learn more about and dive deeper into. So if you leave here and you think, oh, I've got it figured out, sorted, I know what to do, I've probably failed. So if you go away with lots of questions, this is good, this is what we need to do. We need to be digging deeper into this topic and this content. And with the amount of time we have today, you're going to see me talk about things in passing on purpose and talk about things in a little bit more depth on purpose, because I want to ensure that there are some key things you can get out of our session. So the way that I've set up the agenda is that we're going to talk about a comprehensive institution-wide approach, and I'm going to define that for you. We're going to talk in depth about being trauma-informed and what that means in a university setting, and taking that beyond a buzzword that organizations like to use into practical techniques that you can use and things that you can embed into your university processes. We're going to talk about policy development. And mind you, I'm coming from a different legislative space, so I will talk about good principles, but I won't necessarily be speaking in relation to Irish law. So please take that into account in the information that I share with you today. There might be some differences given your legislative context that you would need to consider that's different from the area where I work. And then we'll just touch on prevention and response training, and I'll give you some examples of the training that I've done with other universities, and I do at the university where I currently work as well. So you can see what it can look like to have a training program in this space. Now, I don't know if we've said, but this session is being recorded, okay? And so be mindful of that if you ask questions, if you interact in any way, that there is a recording going on. So keep that in mind if you want to say anything. But I do have a learning agreement that I ask us to follow. It is a seminar. It's not super interactive in the same way that a training would be. There are interaction moments, though. And so I'm going to ask that throughout the seminar, throughout the day, that number one, you take care of yourself. I will be talking about sexual violence, domestic abuse, stalking. I will define these terms for us. I won't be providing graphic stories and examples of these behaviors, but I am going to spend some time today with you talking about the impact that this can have on someone. So we are going to explore that. And so I encourage you during the session to take care of yourself. That might mean stepping out for a moment to get some fresh air, or to go to the toilet, or to get a cuppa. That might mean in your seat zoning out and separating from the content for a moment, okay? I won't call on you unless you ask to be called on. So don't worry if you need to put your head down and look at your phone for a second or anything like that. I'm not going to ask what you're doing. This is your space. We're adults. You engage in a way that makes sense for you. I am also going to ask that you take care of yourself after the session. So before you go to sleep tonight, I'm going to ask each and every one of us, myself included, to do something to practice self-care, a healthy, positive coping skill. We all have coping skills, some less positive than others. Healthy, positive coping skill that you're going to do before you go to sleep tonight, to honor that we're going to spend a good chunk of today speaking about sexual violence, and to honor the fact that in order to do this work, we have to take care of ourselves to be able to sustain the work. So that's a key thing that I will talk about again later in the session, but I want to say up front, during and after the session, I would like you to care for you. I also want you to challenge the idea, not the person. And that simply is a way of saying, if you're not buying what I'm selling, that's okay. Ask about it, let's debate, let's unpick things. This is the time to do it. I'd much rather us do this in this kind of event, this kind of location, rather than if you're sitting in front of a stressed student or employee who's telling you about something that's happened to them. So let's talk through some things, but be mindful of those of us in the room. There will be primary survivors in the room, meaning those of us who have been subjected to sexual violence directly. There will be secondary survivors in the room, meaning those of us who know someone close to us who's been subjected to sexual violence. And then as humans, those of us who have empathy for others also recognize the impact this has. So we need to be respectful in how we enter into debate and we think about ideas together. Finally, I'll ask that you respect confidentiality. So if you have a question that you want to ask about a situation you might have managed or you're working through, please anonymize that information so we're not able to identify anyone that you might be referring to. And then as a group, I'm going to ask that you leave the stories of that question or that comment in the room and take the learning with you. So in other words, don't gossip the stories you might hear today, but take any learning of the concepts that we might get from that discussion. So those are the three things that I ask of you. Does anyone want to add or take away from that list? If you're happy to enter into this learning agreement with me, thumbs up isn't any way derogative right here. We're good with thumbs up? Okay. I forgot to check because you never know when you go into new places. Okay, if I can have a thumbs up if you're consenting to this learning agreement, so you're not being intimidated, threatened, forced, coerced, manipulated. No one in here is drunk or asleep. Fantastic. We are all consenting to use these today. So thank you very much for that. All right, so I'm going to take a few things as read in today's seminar. I'm not going to talk about prevalence rates at universities, okay? I'm not going to go through that. We're going to take it as read that the United Nations identifies sexual violence as an international issue affecting higher education, a global issue. Okay, so we are going to take that as read. We know the Irish government have put a lot of effort into this recently. We know that the funding has been added into Irish universities to look at this issue. So we're not going to spend time on prevalence today. If we were doing a different course about investigating or anything like that, we'd spend more time on prevalence. But today we're going to take that as read. If you want more information on that, I'll give you loads of suggested reading at the end where you can get additional information. We're going to be talking about sexual violence. And the word cloud up here captures the range of behaviors that I'm going to be referring to when I use the shorthand umbrella term of sexual violence. You will note up there some things that don't necessarily fall under automatically, so stalking and domestic abuse, but they're so interrelated, they probably fit better under a term of gender-based violence, but just for the shorthand of today, I'm going to use sexual violence and refer to all of these. Some of these things on this will be criminal offenses. Some of these won't be criminal offenses, but they absolutely could be considered sexual misconduct within an organization. So things like rape jokes, inappropriate sexual comments, banter. That won't necessarily meet a criminal threshold, but absolutely is on the continuum of sexual violence and impacts perpetration and leads to perpetration in like sexual assault and rape. We'll be talking about image-based sexual abuse, sometimes referred to as revenge porn. But image-based sexual abuse is a more appropriate and more neutral term to capture a range of both behaviors. We'll talk about coercion and wolf whistling and cyber stalking, attempted rape, grooming, spiking drinks, all of these things that come within this continuum of sexual violence. Later into the session, I'll give you an example of how you can put these into policy, how you can define them into policy. But I just want to hold that throughout today's session, I'm not just talking about rape. I'm talking about a range of different things that we as universities can address that are happening in our organizations. They're happening amongst our students and employees. And so we need to be mindful. And this is not an exhaustive list, I can assure you. We're going to start by talking about a comprehensive institution-wide approach. With permission from Brian, who's doing our AV today, I'm going to switch microphones. Is that okay? Fantastic. Can you hear me now? Good. I have to walk. I can't be out of the podium. That's going to drive me crazy. Okay, so Brian, is that okay for you? You can hear me? Excellent. All right, so we're going to talk about this comprehensive institution-wide approach. This is an approach that I designed with my colleague, Professor Graham Towell. We looked at international best practice and evidence-based practice to see what is actually effective, meaningful, and working. What is safe and ethical when it comes to universities addressing sexual violence in-house? Okay, so where do we go beyond the tick box exercise and where do we actually see meaningful culture change within structures to prevent sexual violence? And what we were able to find is this model here. This is where we're able to put it all together and say what is actually going to work. So this model is an ethical framework to address sexual violence in higher ed for prevention and response initiatives. And we use what's called a socio-ecological model where we apply at multiple levels of an organization, from the individual, the relationship, the community, all the way to the institutional level, okay? So it's not, when we think about sexual violence, we hear a lot about bad apples. This is a bad person that did a bad thing in our organization, but that doesn't represent our organization. What we know about perpetrators is that's not how it works.
structural things within our organization perpetuate sexual violence. If we think about something like murder, as a community, as a culture, as an organization, we have created structures and a culture that identifies murder as wrong, identifies murder as something to not do, okay? What we haven't done is done that with rape. Although we do know that rape can escalate to murder. We know that those are very interconnected for women particularly. So we at our organizations have to do more than think, oh, we've just got a bad apple in an organization. We have to think about what's happening in our community and in our institution that is perpetuating this type of violence in our home, okay? So that's why we look at this model. It's not just about the individual, it's about all of us, it's about the community, it's about the culture we create. And then we have these 6 elements that have to be applied at all levels. Our policies, our trainings, how we respond to disclosures, how we conduct investigations, how we implement sanctions or any kind of action as a result of misconduct being found. And so what we see here is being trauma-informed is key, and I'm going to expand on that in the next part of the session. But survivor-centered, human rights-based, social justice-based, intersectional, and having perpetrator accountability. If we take one of these things out, it's not going to work. If we don't have all these 6 components in our procedures, in our policies, in our training, in how we work through these types of cases, it's not going to work. Number 1 being perpetrator accountability. If that's not there, nothing else we do matters, okay? So I pushed human rights and social justice together just for the sake of the slide. It was quite big. But let me tell you about these elements of this model. Trauma-informed means that we're going to understand the impact of trauma and how trauma works, okay? We have to actually understand that sexual violence in any form can be experienced as a traumatic incident. It can be experienced as complex trauma if it's happening multiple times, even by different perpetrators. So we as organizations have to have an understanding of trauma, and that has to be built into how we respond and how we prevent. Trauma-informed means we promote safety, we prioritize safety. We don't prioritize university reputation, okay? We prioritize safety of our students and our employees. That's where we take our action, that's where we take our lead. We avoid re-traumatizing our reporting parties, our victim survivors, those who tell us they've been subjected to sexual violence. We put steps in to ensure that when we're working with them, when we are providing them with their options, when we're responding to disclosures, when we're conducting investigations, that we're doing so in a safe way so that we are not worsening their experience. And one of the things that we know that happens when there's bad investigations at universities, that the survivors experience that as what they call a secondary rape. That's found in literature. We know that that's how it feels for them, and it's experiences institutional betrayal as well. So we have to be very careful about how we are engaging with our survivors to keep them safe. And we want to minimize the number of times a reporting party discloses and has to share their story. So for example, and I'm going to use Becky because I know Becky. If somebody comes to Becky and discloses, and then Becky says, oh, thanks for telling me, I need to go talk to so-and-so. And if so-and-so says, oh, thanks for telling me, but actually I'm not the right person, you need to go to this person here. And that person says, yeah, I can do this for you, but if you also want an investigation, you've got to tell so-and-so here. And this person says, yeah, well, I can help you here, but if you want a serious adverse circumstance for a relationship or academic progress, you also have to tell this person here. And it can go on and on and on. And we make people relive their trauma. When we're trauma-informed, we don't do that. When we're trauma-informed, we put systems in place to minimize how people have to share their story in order to access support. When we're survivor-centered, this means that we're empowering those subjected to sexual violence to choose how to take forward that disclosure that they make. They are in control, as long as they're adults, to decide if they want to make a formal report to the police or to the university. They are in control of whether or not they want to start counseling. They are in control of what happens next. If they engage in a reporting process, we ask them what they want out of the process. We find out what outcomes they want, what is justice for them, what is helpful, what is a remedy for them. We engage them in the process throughout and tell them what's happening. We inform them of the outcome of investigations. We inform them of the outcome of disciplinary processes, including telling them what sanction has been imposed as a result of the harm that they were subjected to. We let them know. And most importantly, if we are truly survivor-centered, survivors' voices are part of the development of our training, of our policies, of our procedures, of our campaign work, everything we do. If we don't have survivor voices involved in that, we're not going to be doing it right. We're going to be missing information. We're going to be missing that. And that doesn't mean hiring someone who is a survivor and saying, yep, survivor voice, tick, right? It means engaging with survivors in the institution, having focus groups, having representatives, engaging them in a safe and ethical way. Human rights and social justice space, they actually fit really nicely together because they intersect quite well. What we want to know with that is that the United Nations identifies sexual violence and domestic abuse as human rights violations. Okay? So as organizations, we should be fairly motivated to protect the human rights of our employees and of our students. That should be a key aspect of why we do things and what we do with them. So I don't know the legislative framework here, but I can tell you in the UK that we are required to ensure that students and employees can access their education and their workplace free from the fear of harassment and violence, let alone harassment and violence itself. And that comes under the public sector equality duty under our Equalities Act. So we actually have a legislative requirement to ensure that students and employees can access education and workspace without experiencing these things, which is really important. And obviously we have a lot of other legislative duties we have to balance with that, but it should be at the heart of what we do. And being social justice based means that we are actually considering the impact and harm on the community. It means that we are actually looking at the structures and the culture in our community, and we are disrupting and challenging those which perpetuate sexual violence. And that's a big thing. That's a really difficult thing. That takes years to do, and that takes leadership. That takes senior leadership with an organization to allow for that change. Because the thing about changing structures and culture in an organization like a university is that the status quo, it feels comfortable for those of us that are in power. Us, I'm not really in power, but it's nice to pretend, right? But when we make changes, that feels uncomfortable because we don't know what that change is going to be. But to truly change the culture, it means that we have to think about what within our organization is allowing this to occur. So thinking about staff sexual misconduct, if I've got somebody who's bringing in loads of money through research into the organization, and something is reported against them, as an organization, I have to think, well, that person brings in millions. That's an 18-year-old student who can come and go, and I can get another one of those. Where are our priorities? Are we prioritizing safety? Are we prioritizing reputation? Are we prioritizing money? Difficult one to think about. But remember, when I say university, when I say institution, it's not the building making decisions, it's humans. So humans can choose to do the right thing. Humans can choose to prioritize safety over other things. Intersectional, by a show of hands, how many of you are familiar and feel confident you understand the term intersectional? Okay, a good chunk of us are. I'm just going to briefly describe it because I think it's a word that gets thrown around, and depending on what communities you're in, sometimes it gets a bad rap, which is a bit weird. But intersectionality was a term coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, and she discovered that there was a case involving women in America. These were black women in America who would be discriminated against at work. And they took a case for discrimination to court to say, hey, look, I'm being treated unfairly because I'm a black woman. And at the time, they looked and they interviewed all the other women, and none of the other women were facing discrimination. And they interviewed all the other black people, and none of the other black people were facing discrimination. So the case was thrown out because, nope, you weren't discriminated against because you were a woman, and no, you were not discriminated against because you were black. They were, however, discriminated against as black women. Okay? And this
idea that we have intersecting identities and that we wear multiple identities at once was not conceptualized in law. And so intersectionality is being able to identify that at any point in our lives, we are all multiple things. So I am a woman, I am American Texan, if you're interested. I am heterosexual, I am cisgender, so I identify with the gender I was assigned with at birth that matches my biological sex. I have a religious affiliation, and I can go on and on. And I don't experience those bits about me at one time. They're not separate things. I'm not like, oh, I'm a woman right now. Oh, I'm heterosexual right now. Like, these are not separated for me, okay? And so when we're thinking about intersectionality, we have to realize that the intersecting identities that we all hold shape the privilege and oppression that we experience, okay? And that means that when we're being intersectional in our approach to sexual violence, that we have to hold that there might be different reasons why people are targeted for sexual violence. We might need to engage tailored and specific programs for prevention. We might need to be looking at our ways to respond to disclosures in a different way for different groups. We might need to be identifying policies and procedures that need to be tailored for different groups. And the point of intersectional approach is to be able to really ensure that the diverse needs of our communities are met and that people aren't marginalized in our process, they're not invisible in our process, and they're not ignored. Because a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work. It's easy, it's nice, it's great to, oh, we did a consent workshop. Did that consent workshop meet everyone's needs? Possibly not. Okay, so we need to be mindful of that. And then the very last one is perpetrator accountability. Now, perpetrator accountability is really, really important because perpetrator accountability, if you don't have it, you can have the most robust training program, you can have the best active consent campaign, you can have really, really great policies and procedures, but if people perpetrate sexual violence in your community and you do nothing about it, you are not preventing sexual violence in your community. What you're doing is communicating to would-be perpetrators that you can get away with it. So don't worry about it, just keep on doing what you want to do. Perpetrator accountability is absolutely crucial to true prevention and response. If you don't have it, really, really look into this. This is very important. You need to have policies that you use, that you follow due process, that they're fair, that they follow principles of natural justice, and you need to ensure that they're working. If you have a great policy and no one ever uses it, you just have a piece of paper or maybe a PDF somewhere, okay? That's not going to do anything for you. You need to conduct appropriate investigations. They need to be proportionate and thorough to what's being reported. They need to be trauma-informed and they need to understand what's happening. You need to apply appropriate and proportionate and meaningful sanctions when misconduct does occur. So does that mean you're going to expel everybody? Not necessarily. Does that mean you're going to dismiss all staff? Not necessarily. But you will provide a proportionate response. Will you expel and dismiss people? Yeah, you should do. If we're promoting safety in our communities, then there will be some people who should no longer be part of our communities given the level of violence that they perpetrate. And really importantly, communicate sanctions with your community, okay? At Durham, we actually send an all-staff, all-student email out when we expel students and when we exclude them for 1 year. We don't say who we've expelled and excluded, but we send out an email. We put it on the notices of our external webpage, which is the front page of the university. We publish all of our disciplinary stats on our student conduct office webpage, and we write 2 different trend monitoring papers, one about discipline and one about sexual violence, which are public, but anyone can see, and they can see the raw and analyzed data. We're constantly telling our students and staff when discipline action is taken as a form of prevention and as a way of telling potential survivors, you can trust us. Come and talk to us because we will take action. Look what we did. So this is a really, really important thing that we want to hold. Now, everything that I've just shared today can be found, and I'm going to be talking a lot about this particular book, in this book here. We're going to do a little drawing if anyone happens to want a free copy later on today. But in this other book here, I don't get any money from these, so I can tell you all about them. We expand on the comprehensive institution-wide approach. And we say, you know what? It's not enough just to think about this. We need to be looking for gaps. Where are we getting it wrong?
So when we use a comprehensive institution-wide approach, what should be happening is that we should be then ensuring that we're addressing all forms of sexual violence. You can't tell your students, yes, we'll address sexual harassment, but no, not rape, or no, not stalking, not going to deal with that one. We're either going to do it all or we're not going to do any of it, right? Because we're keeping people safe or we're not. And what we found, and what you can learn about in the book, is there are particular gaps I found in higher education and universities in the UK where we were failing to help students. So we knew that there's an increase in spiking post-COVID that was happening in the UK in particular. I don't know if you have a similar, yeah, okay, we all felt it, yeah. Technology-facilitated gender-based violence has always been there, but it increased and got worse during COVID and it's continued at that level. And there's also been a surge in non-fatal strangulation as part of sexual violence. Now, in the US and now in England, you cannot consent to strangulation in a sexual context. It's because there's no safe way to strangle. Students and staff tend to use the word choke, but the proper term is strangle, okay? And what we're seeing is that this used to be something shown in extreme pornography, and now it's in mainstream media, in mainstream porn, in fan fiction, in TV shows like You, which I don't recommend, I hate that show. Right? It's being seen. There's a new Netflix show as well, something about people cheating. And it also has strangulation as listed in what appears to be consensual sex. It's not something we can consent to. It's not safe. And it's being used more and more in sexual violence. And when I speak to my survivors, they can tell me they didn't consent to it. But when I speak to my perpetrators, they say, oh yeah, girls like that. Do they? Right? So we're now bringing that into our consent education as well because it's being taught through mainstream media and we need people to know it's not safe and not okay and not something we can consent to. When we use a comprehensive institution-wide approach, we should offer tailored initiatives for specific groups who need it. So if you think about students or staff with disabilities, that is a massively diverse group. What I might need to offer for students who have maybe a specific learning disability might be different than the tailored options I need to offer for my deaf and hard of hearing community. There might be different barriers for disclosure for those two communities, right? So we need to be thinking about what things do we need to do within our community. We might need to be thinking about our international students, the students that come to us from China versus the students that come to us from Mexico or America. They might need very different tailored communications and prevention initiatives and response initiatives. So we have to think about that. The LGBT community, the potential barriers to disclosure for that community can be very, very diverse and very, very difficult to unpick. So if I've got someone who identifies as non-binary or trans or identifies as a woman and they transition to as a woman and they don't want people to know that, right? Disclosing something that's happened to their physical body can be quite difficult. And making sure our staff are trained to receive those disclosures, hugely, hugely important. If we have this approach, it will be embedded in all aspects of our university life, including on and off campus. And I found that working in England, particularly, there are gaps where we forget we're a university. When we're on field work, when we're on field trips, we forget, oh, we're living with our students now on a dig site in tents out in Israel. Oh, we're not the university anymore. No, you are still definitely the university, right? You're still protecting those students from abuses of power and from sexual violence. We know in archaeology, anthropology, and geography, fieldwork is an incredibly high-risk area for sexual violence. And that's international. That's not specific to any one country. There's a lot of research going on about that at the moment. We know study abroad is a huge high-risk time for students. I now run training for our students before they go on study abroad. I do safety briefings with them, and I train staff to support study abroad students so that they know how to receive disclosures when someone's abroad and what to do. How do we contact the embassy? How do we contact the police if that's what they want? How do we contact the travel insurance? And have all of that in place before anyone leaves the country. Conferences are another high-risk area for staff sexual misconduct to junior staff and to early career researchers or students. These are still university business. And fun fact, we'll talk about policy in a minute, it doesn't have to be university business for us to deal with it. But when it's university business, we have more control in relation to prevention. because we can say what we can do in those aspects. I can't tell people what they can do on a holiday in Spain when term time's out. I can deal with the outcome of that, but I can definitely say appropriate behavior during the conference. I can put policies and procedures in place for that. And when we do this approach, we should ensure that all staff and students are treated comparably. Okay? So that means if I'm a student and I decide I'm going to make a disclosure, and I come and tell you, this happened to me. Well, if that perpetrator is a student, I should be treated the same as if that perpetrator is a member of staff. What I have found, and I don't know your context, so I can't be critical of it yet, I'll learn, but I know in higher education in the UK in particular, if I'm assaulted by a student, I get a better deal than if I'm assaulted by a member of staff. If I'm assaulted by a student, I'm more likely to be supported by my university. I'm more likely to learn transparently what's happening during the investigation. I'm more likely to get information about the outcome of the investigation and the disciplinary process. If I'm assaulted by a member of staff, I'm less likely to receive support by the university. I'm less likely to know anything about the investigation. I'm less likely to be told anything about the outcome other than it's founded or not founded, and I will never know anything about disciplinary action. That's scary, right? Because I shouldn't get a better job, a better deal if an employee of an organization assaults me over a student, right? So when we do a comprehensive institution-wide approach, what we can see is where are those points in the process and procedures and support where we can ensure equality. Now, there will be potentially some differences that are required due to employment law versus maybe consumer law, or however your students are considered legally in your organizations. But in this book here, I actually have a chart where you can look at student be student, student be staff, staff be student, staff be staff, and answer about 15 questions. And when you answer all 15 of those questions, if you don't have the same answers for all 4 of those categories, you probably have a gap in services and built-in discrimination into your procedures. So really, really important to think about. You can have a lot of things being comparable or even equal without interrupting employment law and consumer law. The issues where we have is that's not how we've done it. That's not what we do. It's the resistance to that's not how we do things that keeps that in place. So those are things I want us to be thinking about, and I want us to be mindful of this as we think about, are we truly comprehensive? The next thing we're going to do, because I've talked for quite a while, is we're going to take a moment in small groups, and this can be pairs, 3 people, 4 people. You can turn around and speak to the person behind you, however you want to speak to someone. And if you're not feeling very social today, you just want to do it for yourself, that's okay, don't worry. But I want you to answer these 4 questions. And this is an opportunity for you to be a little reflective on your situation in your organization. I want you to identify a type of gender-based violence not currently covered in university policy. Now that might be everything, maybe you don't have a policy at all, but be thinking, is there anything that might be happening that we're not currently dealing with and covering? I want you to think about, is there a specific group which may require tailored approaches in our prevention and response initiatives that we've yet to tailor anything for? I want you to think in number 3 of an area of university business not currently covered in policy, or you don't currently have any prevention aspects in place, but might be a high-risk area for you. And then I want you to identify one way staff and students' procedures can differ at the moment, but could be made equal. So think about your procedures. Now, if you don't know the details in your university, don't worry. It's just an opportunity for you to have a little think through what I've talked about so far. While you're doing this, I'm going to be passing around some Post-it notes. They're not for this activity, so don't play with them. They're very pretty. Don't play with them yet. We're going to use them in a bit. Okay, any questions about the activity? All right, over to you. Just very quickly running through a type of gender-based violence not currently covered in university policy. Anyone want to give an example they discussed with their group?
Stalking and spiking.
Stalking and spiking, yes. Stalking for me and domestic abuse are the most high-risk forms of gender-based violence happening in universities. From sexual violence, like rape and sexual assault, we can have things like murder and suicide happen. We can have homicide homicides and suicides. Very, very rare in the sense of universities. Domestic abuse and stalking, much higher risk for that. Much, much higher risk for that. So those are ones, and stalking in particular, I mean, we do it with domestic abuse as well, but stalking is one of those. It's like, oh, they left you some flowers on your second floor window. How romantic. Nah, that's creepy. That's not good. That's a red flag, right? And so we need to be remembering that one. A really good example. A specific group where we might want to send tailored responses. Any examples?
Disabled students.
Disabled students. Anything in particular around that you discussed?
Well, just that like it's such a wide variety of different needs, whether it's like a learning difficulty or a physical disability or all sorts. We also talk about trans students as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So students with disabilities, maybe learning difficulties, physical disabilities, maybe mental health. Also, separate to that, you talked about trans students and needs there. Yeah, so a lot of tailored potential groups that you want, or tailored initiatives that you want to make sure that those groups aren't being ignored and invisible.
I would say migrants, especially from the Asia or Middle East.
Yes, migrant students. So your immigrant students, your international students who are coming in. Particularly as well, thinking about our postgraduate students who might also be bringing families and what's happening there.
So I was just going to say, like, probably every group we need to think about for prevention. I'm thinking of our sports clubs, you know, who go out to do particular things, societies, you know, messaging for all gender identities, you know, particularly men. So probably we need to think about all specific groups.
Absolutely, yeah. So gold star, right? We want to be thinking about all the different groups and what tailored communications, prevention, response initiatives that we have. You got the right answer, so well done. So yes, number 3, what's an area of the university business that it might be a particular gap or blind spot for you guys at the moment? Did you have any examples?
We said going off to conferences.
Going to conferences, yeah.
Contract workers within the university?
Contract workers, absolutely. So are they written into your policy that you're able to deal with any allegations made against them? Or that they make to say, hey, something happened to me whilst I was here? Excellent.
Our students studying abroad are going on Erasmus.
Yes.
And an incident happens over there.
Yes.
Sometimes the response can be, well, that means we report it over there. It's not a university.
Absolutely. I don't know about your context here in Ireland, but I know that in England, our regulating body, which is the Office for Students, has told us that when our students are on study abroad, we still have a duty of care to respond, although the duty of care is being debated in Parliament at the moment. But from their point of view, they're still our students. Excellent, great. Number 4, one way your staff and students' procedures might differ at the moment, but you see that they could become equal. An example there. Anyone get that far?
One of the ones we've been talking about more in one of the earlier topics is particularly people still quite that would be our postgraduate communities, because there's research postgrads and there's all from PhDs all the way to researchers and postdocs that sort of can sometimes fall between being a student in some working relationships and being a colleague in other working relationships.
Absolutely. So we have situations where we have students who might also be employees and making sure that we're addressing that. I have seen sometimes people decide we're going to manage this policy under the student procedure here or under the employee procedure here, not because of when the incident occurred and the hat the person was wearing at the time, but because it's easier for the university to deal with the situation or it lessens somebody's rights. So let's be mindful of when we use those procedures that we're ensuring we're keeping people safe and that's one of the reasons why I want them to be as equal as possible.
The other one we discussed is the dignity and respect policy, where it could be covering staff on staff, student on student, but there may not be staff on student or student on staff.
Excellent. So that's a big gap if we don't have a way to manage when students assault staff or harass staff or when staff assault or harass students. Big, big gap, and absolutely is one that happens and one we want to make sure that we're not missing. Well done. Okay, so hopefully that gave you a chance to start being a bit reflective and thinking a little bit more deeper on this.
what we're going to do now is shift gears slightly, and we're going to think about being trauma-informed, okay? So we've already discussed trauma-informed already through thinking about what it means to have a comprehensive institution-wide approach, but we're going to dig a little deeper, particularly into this one, because I think it's an area that organizations, not just higher ed, but organizations in general, like to latch onto the label, but not necessarily have a lot of knowledge and understanding about what that label truly means. So, trauma-informed practice in the area of addressing sexual violence in higher education is considered best practice. Okay, it is your evidence-based practice. It is what we want to see. It's the best thing that we can do. There's a precedent for using it in higher education through the United States because it was mandated by the White House's Not Alone report during the Obama administration. So it was something that the universities in the US were required to embed into their procedures, particularly in relation to what is called Title IX, where they're dealing with sexual violence or domestic abuse and other forms of gender-based violence in a university setting. But there are other pieces of legislation that are also coming into play there. Because that was done at that time, we have a lot of research and experience thinking about trauma-informed in higher ed and what it means and what it looks like that we can build our knowledge base from. And one of the things I will very, very, very much promote and tell you time and time again is that your investigators and your discipline decision makers must be trained in trauma-informed approaches. They must have an understanding of sexual misconduct and the impact of trauma in order to appropriately investigate. I have investigation experience as a social worker. I used to be a head of department at a psychiatric hospital, and I would conduct investigations in relation to allegations made against employees as well, service user complaints. And one of the things that I recognize as an investigator is that if you ask me to investigate something I don't know anything about, you're going to have a bad investigation. And I think I'm a pretty decent investigator. I'm all right, okay? But if you ask me to investigate tax fraud, well, I don't know anything about tax law. And yeah, I can ask some people some questions and I can dig into the facts, but am I really going to understand whether or not something bad happened, whether or not there was concern, breach somewhere? Probably not. What I found when I came into universities is that universities asked head of departments to conduct investigations into rape. So they're like, hey, you're management, go take on that investigation. And the only knowledge around sexual violence that most of those head of departments had was a layperson's knowledge around what we learned in media, or maybe personal experiences, or things that we've heard from friends or family. They didn't actually truly understand sexual violence, and they absolutely didn't have any understanding of trauma. And so how they asked questions and what they did was not only harmful to the person who had reported, but it led to really bad investigations that didn't come to any factual conclusions, that weren't able to access evidence in a safe and appropriate way. So it's really, really important that your investigations and your discipline procedures are trauma-informed, and that we're training those who are engaging in these activities on behalf of the organization how to do them well, or we're hiring in the right people to do that. So when we think about trauma, this is just a little dip into the neurobiology of trauma in the brain, okay? So there's some really key things, and the reason why we want to be trauma-informed that are so crucial. We know that when someone experiences a traumatic incident, that impacts how they respond during the incident. That impacts how their memories are produced and stored in their brain. Because what happens is that hormones flood the body, and the hippocampus that's used to actually storing our memories in a nice chronological order and very easy to access goes into survival mode and is busy keeping us safe. And our memories instead get stored in a non-linear, non-chronological order, usually attached to sensory data that we cannot easily retrieve. Some research shows that it can take up to 11 months to retrieve or to get back the memories from a traumatic incident, which then can also mean that there'll be delayed reporting, because if I can't remember what the heck happened, how am I supposed to tell you? But also it means that there'll be gaps, because of gaps in memory, and because memories will come back at different points, we'll have changes in statements. So the first time I tell you what happened to me, and it just happened, I'm gonna have gaps. And then maybe 6 months later I come and tell you, and you
you guys talk and think, oh, that's a different story. She must be lying. No, that's my brain. My brain is holding those memories, and they're not stored in a nice way for me to access them. And so as I retrieve those, my story can change because I'm trying to understand what's happened to me. So when we're trauma-informed, we understand that production and retrieval of our memories is different than on a day-to-day basis. And our presentation after a traumatic incident can look different, and it can look different for everyone. So when we think about being trauma-informed, some of the trauma responses I want to introduce you to, if you haven't heard about them before, we usually talk about fight or flight as an autonomic response to trauma. So I see something scary, and I either fight it or I run away. And that's my brain taking over and keeping me safe. Okay? It's not a conscious decision, it's an autonomic response, it's unconscious, where my body takes control and helps me. But what we know is that in rape and sexual assault, and rape predominantly, the most common is actually to freeze. Okay? So toxic immobility. So it's not, if the fire alarm went off right now, which we don't have any fire alarms scheduled, if the fire alarm goes off, we're going to use those doors, we should have said that. But if the fire alarm goes off, we're all going to momentarily freeze and check for danger, and then move forward. That's not the freeze I'm talking about. The freeze I'm talking about is once we see the danger, we freeze. And our body becomes frozen. Our muscles are very tight. We can't move. We cannot speak. We cannot cry out. We can't run away. We can't fight. The door's open. We can't walk out. As an autonomic response, research shows that 70% of those who've been subjected to rape experience that. And it can last from seconds to hours. Now, if I'm an investigator or discipline decision maker, and I say, well, did you say no? Well, if I was frozen, I couldn't. The other one is flop, or catatonic immobility. This is sometimes referred to as playing dead, but it's where we become unconscious as a defense mechanism, and our body becomes floppy. Our muscles are malleable. It's just completely just unconscious, and you're just there, dead weight. And if we're unconscious, are we making memories? Nah. So that can also happen during sexual violence, but most commonly we see freeze. Friend, or appease, as it sometimes is referred to, is your one conscious defense mechanism. And that's where somebody says, yeah, just go ahead, because they're so scared. They try to friend, they try to be nice, they do anything that can get that person to do whatever they want and out the door so they can get to safety. Right? So we see people who say yes, but that is not free yes, it's given, but the yes is coerced or intimidated or threatened or forced, right? Because they're scared. So trauma responses are really important. As investigators and discipline decision makers, if we don't know about that, how the heck are we going to conduct proper investigations? Because that is crucial. A lot of times we hear a case of sexual violence, and even if we personally have had our own experience or knowledge of sexual violence, we think, oh, that's not what I do, that's not what I would do. But we know that any response can be valid. And I don't know, has anyone seen the show Unbelievable? Anybody familiar with that? Oh, one in the back. Unbelievable. Highly, highly recommend. It's a true story that they've made a movie about. And in this story, the point that I want to make here is that a woman is subjected to rape, and she tells her mom and another woman, and these two older women had also been subjected to rape. They didn't respond to the same way when they were raped, so they didn't believe her. Because they're like, nah, if that happened to you, you would have done what I did. And that's just not how trauma works. That's not how our bodies, our brains protect us and keep us safe. So I really want us to be mindful of that. Because of our traumatic memories being stored in the way they are, knowing that we'll have those gaps, know that we're having consistent statements due to errors in recall, and the wide range of emotional experiences. I might speak to you and tell you about something whilst being very professional and resilient, and you might think, oh, if that happened to her, she'd be crying and bawling her eyes out. Or I might giggle and laugh a little bit while I tell you about my trauma as a nervous response. I might not make eye contact with you, and I might shift and fidget while I'm speaking to you. And if I don't make eye contact when I'm being a little shifty and fidgety while I'm speaking to you, what do you usually think? I'm a liar. right? But that is a normal trauma response. And so we have to understand this. And if we don't embed this in our investigations, if we don't embed this in our disclosure response, if we don't double check these things in how we are building our prevention response initiatives, we are not going to be running actual investigations that are safe and ethical, that provide us with facts. There's been criticism of trauma-informed responses in the US by a certain administration that I'm not going to name. And so I don't like the name. But that particular administration said, oh, well, you're talking about trauma, so you're just biasing all the investigations. No. If I present with trauma, if I have a trauma response, an investigator still has to find evidence based on the balance of probabilities that I experienced what I said I experienced. Maybe my dog passed away the day before, and that's why I'm responding. Just because I'm acting in a certain way doesn't automatically prove on the balance of probabilities what happened. We still conduct the investigation, and trauma-informed investigations allows our investigators to get to more evidence and find better conclusions. So we don't get false positives or false negatives. We get facts that we're able to use evidence to demonstrate how we came to our conclusions. So you will have cases that end in no further action. You will have cases that end in further action, disciplinary action, when you use trauma-informed approaches. And we must know that delayed reporting should be expected. It will be the norm. If I've got someone in a room and my investigator says, well, why did you wait so long to make a report? This was so serious. That's not a trauma-informed question. An appropriate question might be, can you tell me what led you to raise this report? That might be okay if they want to understand how the report came forward, that's fine. But why did you wait so long is not understanding trauma. Building on this, I want us to understand the effects of sexual violence on victim survivors. Now, I switch between some language, so I say reporting parties when I'm referring to someone who's reported they've been subjected to sexual violence. I say victim survivors or survivors when I'm discussing someone who has been subjected to sexual violence. I say perpetrator when I'm talking about someone who has perpetrated sexual violence. I say responding party when I talk about someone who's been accused. So as you hear me switch in and out of that language, is meaningful. That's what I'm doing. And I personally use victim survivors because I know working with individuals that those labels have meaning at different points that are important. And I also know that not everyone survives sexual violence. So we can't always use the term survivor. So when I'm talking about this is where I'm coming from. But this is on the individual. I'm not going to talk about effects on the perpetrator. I'm not going to talk about effects on the university community. I'm not going to talk about the big social and networking community effects today, just for the sake of time. So the harms are even further than this, but we're going to focus today on the individual. Physical impact of things like rape. Can it be injury? Do you have to be injured during rape? Absolutely not. Can you be injured during rape? Yes. Sexually transmitted infections or diseases. Pregnancy. Long-term pain. And we do see suicide or attempted suicide as a result of sexual violence. This is a non-exhaustive list, but these are the most common things we see. We see emotional responses of guilt and shame. This is probably 100%. I would say 100% of people I work with and know experience guilt and shame. If only I hadn't worn what I wore. If only I hadn't gone out that night. If only I hadn't let so-and-so in my room. If only I hadn't gone to the club. If only I hadn't had a drink. All the blame is put on themselves. We as a society are really good at blaming victims. We do that already. And we do that to protect ourselves because we're like, oh, well, I wasn't wearing that, so I would be fine, right? It has nothing to do with our clothing. We know that. But we know that it's easy to blame people because it makes us feel safer. The responsibility is on the perpetrator. And we know that perpetrators, if someone protects themselves, that's great. The perpetrators move on to the next person, right? So we're not just being able to protect ourselves doesn't stop perpetration. So that is something we know and hold. But guilt and shame is a real difficult emotional response because it's so embedded and so encouraged and validated by society. Anger and rage, low self-esteem, hopelessness, helplessness can all be responses. Does everyone have to experience all of these? No, but many of these are experienced. We see practical issues and effects, such as limiting choices, So maybe someone who used to enjoy going out dancing doesn't feel safe to go dancing, so they stay home. Maybe someone wants to go to the lecture, but the perpetrator's at the lecture, so they can't go to the lectures. We see people leave academia as a career. We see students withdraw from the university. And how many of us will know when our students withdraw due to sexual violence? Probably not. We don't get that level of detail. They don't have to tell us. They can make up anything. But we know that they're leaving. When we survey our students, we know that that's why they're going. Difficulty with medical visits, such as if someone's been assaulted, maybe orally or in other parts of their body. Maybe someone who could access a cervical smear doesn't go for their checkups because they don't want to be touched there. Maybe they don't go to the dentist because they were orally assaulted. So they're missing preventative medicine that has long-term, lifelong medical impacts on them, potentially, if cancer is being missed in those pre-screenings. We know that change in behavior can also be really common. When someone's assaulted or is harmed in any way through sexual violence, the control has been taken away from them by a perpetrator. So in order to get that control back, people act differently to try to get control. So they might isolate more than they used to. Maybe a social butterfly now never leaves the house. Or maybe someone who used to be quite reserved is going out and doing things they wouldn't normally have done before. Maybe they're doing risky behaviors like having sex with strangers when they wouldn't have done that before. Maybe they're drinking, maybe they're using drugs, maybe they're driving erratically. Maybe they're controlling how much they eat, and they're moving into potential eating disorder, trying to build that control into their life. So these are all very common things we can see. And of course, psychological impacts. Flashbacks, feelings of dissociation, so not being able to stay in the here and now with us. Feelings of depression or diagnosis of depression. Anxiety or diagnosis of anxiety disorder, like post-traumatic stress disorder. I know in the US there are more women diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder due to sexual violence than there are veterans and active duty military diagnosed with PTSD due to their time in combat. It's depressing. But it's true, it's real. These things are real. These things are happening in our university communities. Our students and staff are trying to live their lives, go to work, go to school, study, make progress whilst dealing with this. So from my point of view, I'd love to spend way more time in prevention than response, because response means the harm's already happened. But it's hard to get universities focused on prevention. It's hard to measure prevention. It's hard to do that. It's easy when there's someone there in distress to say, oh, we need to respond to that, and we'll resource for that. But these are the things we want to prevent. This is what we want not to have happen. We're going to do an exercise now where I'm going to give you an opportunity to build some empathy. Now, in this conversation, I'm going to ask you to do some things individually. You're not going to share with anybody. You're not going to have to say anything out loud unless you want to, okay? I'll keep you all very, very safe, I promise that. If you don't want to engage, that's okay. Don't feel like you have to. So if you're thinking, oof, you know, I just need a moment, just sit in your seat or take a break, whatever you need. But we're going to do an exercise where we think about a little bit what some of our students and employees might be dealing with. So you should all have 4 Post-it notes at your desk. If you don't have any Post-it notes, can you raise your hand and we'll make sure, ooh, there's a group there. Becky, can you assist these ladies here? There's some extra ones up there. Does everyone have a pen? Some kind of writing utensil? We've got some pens up here. If you need any, raise your hand.
No, you're fine.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So you should have 4 Post-it notes with you. If you end up not having 4 for any reason, you just actually need 4 pieces of paper. So you can take 1 Post-it note and cut it into 4, tear it into 4, whatever you need to do. But you should have 4 Post-it notes: an orange one, a pink one, a green one, and some kind of yellow one. Okay? what I'm going to ask you to do, and again, this is individual work, this isn't for you to share. I'm going to ask you to answer some questions on the Post-it notes, and we're going to do them one at a time. You can either write your answer using a word, okay, or you can draw a symbol on your Post-it note to remind you what you mean, okay? So with your orange Post-it note, or your first Post-it note, I would like you to write down a place where you feel the safest. A place where you feel the safest. Either write down the name of that place or draw a little picture of it. You don't have to share it with anyone, but write down a place you feel the safest. On your pink Post-it note, I want you to write down the name or draw a little picture of the person you trust the most. Now, this does have to be a person who is alive, and it cannot be a dog or a cat or any other animal, okay? A person you trust the most on your pink Post-it. On your green Post-it, I would like you to write down a hobby or an activity that you enjoy the most. Something that brings you some joy in your life. And then on your yellow Post-it, I would like you to either write down or just put a dot to represent a secret, something you've never told anyone. Could be that you wear your socks for 5 days in a row without changing them. I don't care what it is, but a secret nobody knows about you. You put a little dot, you don't have to draw it or write it down, but something to represent a secret on your yellow Post-it. Okay, so go ahead and grab your orange Post-it, the place where you feel the safest. Now I'd like you to call out adjectives of how that place makes you feel. What does that place bring for you? Why does it make you feel the safest?
Comfort.
Comfort, good one.
Familiarity.
What was that?
Familiarity.
Familiarity.
Security.
Security.
Safety.
Safety.
Peace.
Peace. One more?
Freedom.
Freedom. Lovely.
Joy.
And joy. All right. Think about your pink Post-it, your person you trust the most. Tell me, how does that person make you feel? Why do you trust them the most? Loved. Heard. Respected. Safe. Loyal. Trust. Supported. A good listener. And valued. All right, and now go to your green Post-it note. That hobby or activity you enjoy, how does that make you feel? What was that? Joyous. Alive. Ooh, alive. I like that one. Connected. Energized.
Self-help.
Self-help. Purposeful. Turned off, yeah. We need a little bit of that. One more?
Confident.
Confident, and what was that? Strong, thank you. All right, excellent. Okay, go back to your orange Post-it. Go ahead and crumble it up for me. Becky is gonna, maybe someone, Kate's gonna help me out today. Kate is gonna I'm gonna ask you to crumble up your orange Post-it and pass it to the side of your row. And Kate's going to go ahead and throw that in the bin for us. Or trash can for the Americans in the room. Trash. So, the reason why I've asked you to crumble up the place where you feel the safest and throw it in the bin or trash can. What do y'all call it in Ireland? Is it a bin? A bin, okay. The reason why I've asked you to throw away the place you feel the safest is because the majority of rapes occur in a place where the survivor felt safe. In their home, in their accommodation, in their workplace. We know that rape can happen in dark alleys by strangers in the night, but those are incredibly rare. Incredibly rare. Most rapes happen in the safe location. So that means that most of the survivors in our universities no longer have the place that they felt the safest. Their home is not safe, their accommodation isn't safe, the lab isn't safe, the lecture hall, somewhere where they felt safe was taken from them. So I'm going to ask you, when I've taken away your safe place and you don't have access to it anymore, how does that make you feel?
Afraid. Lost. Destabilized. Insecure. Shocked. Vulnerable. Nauseous. Traumatized. Terrified.
These come a little quicker. Anxious. I know I didn't get everyone's, but we're getting the idea here. Okay? Go ahead and take your pink Post-it note for me. I'd like you to crumble it up. Someone besides Kate want to volunteer? All right. Kate's all about taking away your happiness, so I'd like you to crumble up the person you trust the most and throw them in the bin. We can do this one a bit quieter so I can tell you a little bit about this one and why we're doing this one now, okay? We know that the majority of sexual violence is perpetrated by someone known and trusted by the survivor. Most rape and sexual assault that occurs is done by a friend, a family member, a partner, a peer, a loved one, a current partner or former partner, someone you work with. Stranger rape is very, very, very rare. About 10% of cases that are reported. Most times it's someone's married to, someone's living with, someone who's already been in a consensual relationship with, someone they trust, a supervisor, a lecturer, captain of a team. And on top of that, a lot of times when we tell the people that we trust the most what's happened to us, they blame us. They say, well, why were you out there? Well, why did you drink that much? Why did you let them in your room? What were you doing? Why didn't you keep yourself safe? So even if it wasn't the person that was the safest for us that hurt us, the person who's the safe person very often blames us for what happened to us. So it means for many of our survivors on our campuses, they've lost that safe person. So when I take your safe person away, really it was Kate, it wasn't me. How do you feel? Devastated. Alone. Abandoned. Betrayed. Confused and sad. Torn. Can I have one more? Cast adrift and vulnerable. All right, now take that green Post-it, that hobby you enjoy, that activity that brings you joyous feelings, makes you feel alive, connected, energized. Go ahead and throw that in the bin for me. Becky's going to take that away from you today. For many of our students and staff who experience sexual violence in a university context, because it was someone known to them, and because many of our communities are quite small, it means that the things that we enjoyed doing are no longer safe. Maybe the perpetrator's there or friends of the perpetrator's there, but we can't go to them anymore. So if we were both on the same, I'm trying to think of a sports team, but I'm not sporty. I was going to say chess team. That gives you my indication of how sporty I am. Right? If we were on the same chess team and the perpetrator's there, I can't go play chess anymore. I can't go swimming anymore. I can't go play rugby. I don't know what sports there are, but you get the drift. In our communities, we have survivors who no longer can go to the things that bring them joy, that make them feel alive. So when Becky took away your hobby, how does that make you feel? What was that? Stunted. Mad. Disconnected. Depressed. Angry. Drifting. Isolated. One more?
Not dead.
All right. Go ahead and take your yellow Post-it. Becky doesn't need to stand up. Thank you, Becky. So, we learned about trauma in the brain today. We learned about how our brain protects us, but how that impacts how we're able to communicate what's happened. We learned about the effects of sexual violence physically, emotionally, and psychologically, and practically as well. And we also saw how our safe place can be taken from us, our safe person can be taken from us, our favorite hobby or activity can be taken from us. What are we left with? Secret. We're left with a really big secret that we don't necessarily know how to communicate. Maybe English is my second or third language, and I don't even know how to tell you in English what's happened. I don't trust. I don't know what you're going to do if I tell you this. I don't know if you're going to take it away and go run and tell the police and do anything. I don't want the person who harmed me to come to any negative consequence because I love them. They're someone I cared about, and I actually don't want them to be getting into any trouble. I don't want them to get fired. I don't want them to get expelled. So for many of our survivors, we're walking around with a secret. And all this that we've been talking about during this part of the session. So as university staff, as practitioners, as activists, as senior leaders, as policymakers, as people who might respond to disclosures or deal with investigations or discipline or counseling, what we have to realize is the information we hold at the university about what's happening on campus is probably the tip of the iceberg, number one. There's probably a lot of people who haven't shared their secret yet. And we've got people who are either walking around experiencing all this and have been able to seek some help, or they're holding all this and there's some barriers for them coming forward. So to be trauma-informed in a university means understanding this. To be trauma-informed in a university means that we have to build processes into our organization to help with this. We need to create space for people to come forward. We need to make sure people aren't marginalized. We need to make sure people can trust us, and we have to demonstrate that trust by communicating what we do. And if we say we're going to do something, we need to actually take action. Words aren't enough. We need to demonstrate that action. So, feeling mad and disconnected and depressed and angry, vulnerable, torn, depressed, afraid, devastated, lost, insecure, trapped, and traumatized. I can say that today, your stuff's in the bin. You can take it out and take it home with you. You can have your person and your place and your activity back. But there are a lot of people on your campuses that don't have that. And there might be some of us in this room that also don't have that. So we need to, as a sector, do better. We need to, as a sector, help. We need to recognize, guess what, when I've got a survivor coming to me and they're angry and they're rage and they're talking to me and saying the university's not doing enough and they're mad, that's not a problem child for me. That's a survivor who's been traumatized. I don't take that personally. I don't get upset when students come at me with rage. I recognize it for what it is. It's not about me. I mean, it might be about what the university's doing. That might be instigating the conversation. But I recognize how they're communicating that is because there's all that other stuff going on for them. So, take a big deep breath. We are about 23 minutes away from lunch. So just to do a little check-in, do you want to stand up, shake it off? Do you want to get some fresh air and come back in 5? Or do you want to move into policy? How are you feeling? Let's have 5 minutes. If you come back in 5, whether you're here or not, I'm starting in 5 minutes. Take a moment. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move forward. So just a few more things to talk through, and then I promise you will get some food. But I know we've got a lot to do for in the afternoon, and you also have the lunch after this. We want to make sure we're respecting that time and not going over today. So I am going to keep us to our time. So thinking about being trauma-informed, one of the things that I just want to highlight as we move into policy is making sure that we are building in support for our survivors, making sure that whether they disclose and or they report, whether they tell us what's happened, and then they also choose to take some action, we want to make sure, of course, that we're trauma-informed, that we've got clear reporting pathways built into our procedures. In this book here, there's a chapter, it's the very first chapter within the UK setting on specialist case management into gender-based violence by Kelly Prince and Peter Franklin Corbin. Highly recommend that chapter because it highlights how important it is to have specialists managing these cases in the university. So hiring in or training up and making sure people are appropriate to manage risk and conduct risk assessments. That we're using specialist counselors, so building partnerships with our local rape crisis is key. So your counseling service in-house might have qualified people to conduct counseling, but they might not have the amount of time to process. So for example, at Durham, we pay our local rape crisis to provide counseling to students and staff of all genders, and they offer up to 20 sessions, whereas our regular counselors can only offer 6 sessions. Okay, you can't do this work in 6 sessions. Okay, my background as a therapist, there's absolutely no way I would do any trauma work in 6 sessions, and particularly given session 1 is build rapport, session 6 is usually a follow-up, section 5 is the one where we close. So you only have really a few sessions there in the middle to do any good work. So bringing in counselors from local rape crisis. For us, because we pay our counselors to come on site and meet with our students and staff, the longest waiting list I've had survivors wait is about 8 weeks at the most. And you might think, oh, 8 weeks is a bit long. In the community, it's currently 18 months for the same service. So we're cutting the queue a bit, but we're doing it for our students and our staff. Really, really important to have those partnerships. Make sure you're bringing those people in and pay them, okay? I can promise no matter what financial situation your university is in, it's in a better position than your local rape crisis, okay? Make sure we're not exploiting our charities that we partner with. Thinking about disclosure training, making sure you have staff who are trained appropriately to respond to disclosures. I offer training, which we'll talk about at the end of today's session, for all staff, and it's essentially first aid for sexual violence. Because we can't say, oh, you can tell this person, but not this person here, right? Students and staff disclose to people that they find that are trusted. So we want everyone to have that basic knowledge. They're not the right person to continue providing support, but they are the right person to be able to give non-directive signposting and support in that moment to get them to where they should go. And also, they can make sure that they're not opening things up, not asking investigative questions. And so this training I teach, the sexual violence first aid training I teach, supports students and staff to be able to respond to disclosure at uni, out in the community with their friends, at another place of employment. It's the basics of first aid disclosure training that we want. And then when we're supporting survivors, we want to always include risk assessment within everything we do. Prioritizing, again, what? Safety. What we talked about as being survivor-centered, we prioritize safety. So we build this into our policy work. And what we're going to think about now before lunch is just setting up the principles of policy development. Okay? So we're just going to take a moment to get kind of into the nitty-gritty of what do we mean by policy and what does that look like. So if we have a policy, you might call it a sexual misconduct policy or a sexual violence and misconduct or gender-based violence policy. But if we have a policy that is actually going to be meaningful, we want it to act as a deterrent and a guardian for the prevention of sexual violence in our community. So it needs to be more than a piece of paper. Deterrent means that would-be perpetrators know about the policy, recognize that it can be used. Sorry, sound person. Sorry, Brian. That was very loud. That we have these things in place so that perpetrators are thinking, ooh, if I do something here and I get caught, I could get in trouble. Okay, that's a deterrent. Guardians are going to be the people who are enacting the policy. They're the humans who are going to use the policy. Those are our investigators, our discipline decision makers, right? Those are the people that are going to actually make the policy have legs and work. Okay? So that's what our policy should be doing. If it's a piece of paper that no one ever uses, if no one ever reports on it, you might as well not have it. Because it's not that you don't have sexual violence happening in your community. It means you don't have people who trust that that policy is going to do anything for them. So, we want to include in this a clear reporting and investigation procedure for students and staff. So as an example, at Durham, we have a policy that covers all students and staff, and then we have a procedure if you're a student who's been accused, and we have a procedure for staff who've been accused. So a student or an employee who is the survivor, who reports a perpetrator who is a student, we use a student procedure. For a student or staff who reports an employee, we use the employee procedure. Okay, so the procedures we use are based on who the accused party is, because we're going to be taking action potentially against that individual. But everyone's covered. Contracted staff are covered. Okay, 0 hours, whatever, to part-time staff, everybody is covered. So that anyone who comes on campus that we pay in any way, we make sure, whether there's student staff dual status or whether temporary staff visiting, they are covered in policy. And within that, students can read or staff can read those procedures and know exactly what's going to happen if they make a report. It tells them what we do if they disclose. It tells them what we do if they make a report to the police. It tells them what we do if they make a report to the university. It tells them what we do if they make a report to the police and it doesn't go anywhere and it comes back to us. It tells them what investigation will look like. There's no questions. You can read it and you can see what's going to happen, which is really important when people are choosing if they want to come to the university. Now, are all of our staff and students going to read a policy? No, they're not. But when they need it, are they going to look to it to understand what's happening? Yes. Yes, they will. So it's very important that it's very clear in there. Having support available for all, regardless of whether or not they choose to make a report, is really important. You don't want to hold support away from people and say, well, you've not made a report yet, so sorry, you can't be supported. Or we don't have any proof that this happened, so we're not going to support you because we've not investigated it yet. It takes time for people to decide if they want to make a report, and so we want to ensure that they're accessing support as soon as possible. I will work with students and staff for a year and a half before they decide to make a report, and through that time, they are getting support. They've got the counseling. It's often through the processing and counseling that they feel enabled and empowered to go forward with the reporting process, because they're built up a little bit more. They build up some resilience. They process things. They have more intact memories at that point. So they're able to better articulate what's occurred and feel more equipped to engage in an investigation. Okay? Very, very important. And maybe some never do report and they just access support, and that is okay too. We want to ensure, and again, I don't know your legislative framework, so if this feels different, that's okay. Hold your hand up and let me know. But in the UK in particular, we ensure that if something's a criminal offense, that students and staff can choose to make a report to the university and or the police. So they don't have to go to the police if they're an adult. They can choose to not do that. A lot of times it's someone they care about who's hurt them, and they don't want that person to be in trouble with the police, but they would like the university to do something about it to keep them safe at uni. They don't want the specifics of potentially going to jail or prison to be part of that person's life, but they absolutely want to be able to access their lectures safely. Okay? So we support that. And if, in our cases, if someone goes to the police and then it gets no further action at the police or Crown Prosecution Service level, they can come back to us. If it goes all the way through court and there's a not guilty or acquittal, they can still come back to us and we can still conduct an investigation. Because at the university, we are investigating a breach of policy, misconduct, using a civil standard of proof, the balance of probabilities. The police are investigating a criminal offense, using the criminal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So in the real world, outside of higher education, if I report to the police rape and it gets a not guilty verdict in court, I can take that exact same case to civil court. On the balance of probabilities, civil court, a judge can find in my favor. We are doing the exact same thing in universities that we can do in the real world in civil court, or that other sectors do in a work setting. So it's not abnormal, it's not weird, it's exactly what we do with, we're dealing with civil standard of proof. And we use the civil standard of proof always because we as a university will never have ability to access enough evidence to prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt unless somebody admits guilt. You cannot conduct forensic medical examinations. As a university, you can't read forensic medical examination reports. You can't conduct forensic examinations of people's devices, their computers, their laptops. You cannot seize them. You cannot compel witnesses to cooperate in an investigation. You do not have the same level of access to evidence. You can't get CCTV from external bodies. You can only use your own. You're never going to get enough evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt in a university setting. So we can't have a standard where we don't have the same evidentiary access. So we always use a civil standard of proof, which should be the same for academic misconduct, should be the same for bullying, harassment, discrimination. It should be across the board for everything that you do. And within a policy, your scope can be, it actually can be on and off university business and campus and premises. So what this means is that if I'm a student and I go on a ski trip in January outside of term time with my friends, and while I'm there, my fellow student assaults me. And we're on the same course, we're in the same classes, the same seminars, same lectures, same labs, everything. And we go back to the university. Am I going to be safe at university? No. So in the UK context, because we have a duty of ensuring students can access their education, we have the ability to address that because it's happened whilst they're under contract as university students. We've told students within our policy that we can deal with things that happen outside of term time, off campus, if it happens amongst our university community and our members, and if it impacts their ability to access their education. So we have the ability to investigate that. So that's probably the most extreme example that universities are like, whoa, you can investigate something whilst they're on holiday? Yeah, we can and we do. The majority of our cases happen during term time, on campus, or in accommodation. How many of you guys have students that live off campus? Yeah. Everybody, right? We all have students that live off campus. Most sexual violence happens in people's homes. We can't have a rule in place that says we don't investigate things that happen in your home and still keep people safe in the lecture halls. Probably not going to have many assaults that happen in the lecture hall. So if the scope of your policy says it only can happen on campus, you're missing out all of your liver outs. Okay? So you've got to build that scope in and you have the ability. Now again, I don't know your legislative framework off the top of my head, so if that doesn't fit with what you're allowed to do, take that to heart, okay? I don't want to speak and give you incorrect information, but check what is allowed, what's appropriate, what's expected within your organization. And just know that other universities and other places can do it like that, okay? So, we're going to take a break now and have some lunch, have some food. When we come back, we're going to talk about policy definitions, we're going to talk about some procedure, give you some examples of ways you can actually go through a process with a student or an employee who reports or discloses sexual violence or who might be disciplined for such. We're also going to talk about training in the second half, and we're going to do a little bit about self-care. But I really encourage you, during your break, to take a moment of self-care for yourself. Don't necessarily spend the entire lunchtime talking about sexual violence. Maybe talk about something nice. Okay? You have permission to talk about other things. A quick comment here.
I have one of the questions before you move off.
Oh, yeah, sure. We've got a minute.
So in terms of if somebody chooses to make a complaint to the guards, to make a complaint, we can obviously come back. Can they happen concurrently?
That's a great question. So if it's with the police, can the university investigate at the same time? In England, if it's a student case against a student, no. We have guidance by the sector that says, no, you need to pause the investigation. If it's against an employee, we have permission to investigate once the police give us a go-ahead. So for employee cases or anything against an employee, we can investigate concurrently with police approval. With students, we're told to pause, and that simply is because we don't want to ruin a police investigation, and there's also a different level between them being consumers versus employment law that we have to manage. But yeah, that's how we do it in England, and that's simply from sector guidance that we have that in place at the moment. Yeah, great question. Apologies, because I'm a little behind on time. This was supposed to be a Q&A session, but I took a bit of time, and I haven't given you a Q&A. You will have time for more questions in the session, second half, so apologies if you've got them. We'll get to them. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely lunch. Also, please come back at 1:15. That's when we're starting. I hope you all were able to get some food, have a nice little break, have a good chat. What's the word for chatting y'all use? A crack? Crack? I'm trying to learn the lingo. I've only been here for 24 hours, but I think I've got it. Okay, so we're going to get back into policy this afternoon. It's a little bit less interactive in that I don't have activities planned for us to do, but we will have Q&A, and feel free to interrupt me and ask questions as we go through today. I'm going to be watching the clock because we've got the launch after this, but just know that that's okay thing to do. So let's see where we are. Brian, can you put that up for me? Thank you so much. Okay, so we talked a little bit about some of the principles within policy development that we want. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the definition of sexual violence, okay? Now, this is an example of how we can put it into policy. But before I get into that definition, I want to just ask, how many of you are familiar with the definition of consent in Ireland? Anybody want to be brave and try to give us a summary definition?
I can do my best, but it's consent is that it has to be freely given, ongoing throughout sexual activity. You can change your mind at any point before or during. I know everything it doesn't include. If you're unconscious, if there's a well-founded fear of the force or threat of force being applied to you or someone else, if you're too intoxicated or too incapacitated, if for some reason your disability means that you can't communicate consent in a way that someone can understand, if there's the age of consent being 17, there's more stuff around that. It's online and in person, and that's all that I know off the top of my head.
That is very comprehensive. Give her a hand. Thank you. Okay, so some key words in there: freely given, freedom. So being able to give consent means that we're not intimidated, we're not threatened, we're not coerced, and we're not forced. Because if we're saying yes under those circumstances, that's not freely given. The age of consent being 17, being awake, not asleep, being conscious, not unconscious, right, means we have capacity to give consent. We are in a physical state where we're able to give consent. When we are incapacitated by drink or drugs, that means that our judgment is impaired due to substance. So just because I've had a sip of something, that doesn't mean I'm automatically incapacitated, but at the point at which that level of substance impacts my judgment, that's where I become incapacitated. So based on people's tolerance levels, all those sorts of things can impact when someone becomes incapacitated due to alcohol or other substances. And it can ongoing, so we always need to have consent ongoing, which means that someone can withdraw it before or during a sexual activity. It's specific to the sexual act. So someone can consent to kissing, but maybe not intercourse. Maybe they consent to vaginal intercourse, but not anal intercourse, okay? A consent is not a free-for-all for the body. And it's specific to the time and activity that's happening, meaning that just because we've been married for 40 years doesn't mean that it's automatic consent. It is specific to that, okay? So we don't automatically have consent. I do a lot of training with staff, and sometimes I'll ask them for the definition. You've done much better than many. Sometimes I'll hear, oh, well, you have it until you're told otherwise. That's not correct. That is not correct, right? So we need to know these definitions, and we teach our students and our employees these definitions. And you should also have consent written into your policy. I haven't fit it into our session today because of time, but let me now tell you about what we are worried about in policy, which is when things happen without consent, okay? I think there's a sheet of paper going around to put your name on. This is so if you would like to be in a drawing for one of these books, your name is in the hat. So feel free to fill that out. Thanks to those of you who are helping that go around. At Durham University, this is the example I'll use today. This is how we define sexual misconduct and violence. It's any conduct of a sexual nature that's unwanted or not consensual. Okay, it can happen in person, by letter, telephone, text, other form of social media. And this is a non-exhaustive list. Okay, so the reason why it's written out in this way is so that we have some words to allow us to conduct investigations. But because it's non-exhaustive, we can also deal with other issues. So the first one there is engaging or attempting to engage in a sexual act with another individual without consent. In criminal terms, in England, that covers rape, attempted rape, and assault by penetration. Okay, but we are not going to use that language because we're not making a judgment on a criminal offense. We are making a judgment on a potential breach of policy that is behavior that looks like that. So for our survivors who take a lot of importance in labeling something rape, they can find it really difficult that we're not calling something rape. And I get it. For some of our survivors who aren't ready to use the R word, that's actually fairly helpful because they're not ready to call it what it is. But for the purposes of the university, we'll get ourselves in a muddle, at least in the England context, if we start calling things criminal offenses when we're not the Crown Prosecution Service. So we define the behavior and policy as a misconduct, even though that behavior in another context might be labeled something different. So that's the reason we do it this way in the English context, okay? That might not look the same for y'all. You might have some more flexibility in your country here, but just so you understand, that's why we're listing it this way. What is important, whether you use the R word or not, is that you define what it is. Okay, now in England, if we'd used the rape and defined it as such, rape in England is the penetration of the vagina, mouth, or anus of another person without their consent, but the penetration has to be with a penis. So only somebody with a penis can be charged with rape. And that doesn't capture, is that the same here? Okay, so that's the same here. So that's a quite limited definition, given penetration can happen with digits, sex toys, weapons, etc., right? And so we have this, which covers assault by penetration, which covers things that aren't penetration without a penis, but that allows us to have a more open definition and cover other forms of sexual violence. The next one down, sexually touching another person without their consent, is our sexual assault definition, and that's any above or below clothes, and obviously in criminal law is that sexual assault, but for us is misconduct. The next one down is sexual harassment, okay? We've got inappropriately showing sexual organs of another person is indecent exposure listed there. The next one is a really bad definition, so don't necessarily copy it. Repeatedly following another person without good reason is our stalking definition. Kind of narrow, not exactly what we mean. We get away with it because it's a non-exhaustive list, so we can link to that when we're talking about stalking cases, but stalking is so much more than that, and it also includes cyber stalking. So that's not the best way to write out stalking. So I just caution you on copying this. Recording or sharing intimate images of another person without their consent. This could be
People having consensual sexual acts together, but someone's recording it without the consent of one party, okay? That would be misconduct for us, also a criminal offense. Or it could be someone saying, hey, send me a picture of your breast. And the person says, okay, here's a picture of my breast. And that sharing is consensual, but then the person who receives the picture of the breast goes, hiya, look everyone, look what I got. That's not consensual, that is misconduct, and that is also a criminal offense. And in England, I know the age of consent is different. What's the age of consent for sharing or receiving intimate images in this country? 18, right? So age of consent for a sexual act is 17, sharing, receiving nudes, 18. So that's also relevant. And then the last one there is arranging or participating in events aimed at degrading those who've been subjected to sexual violence. So this is a way for us to say, hey, we are stopping inappropriate events. We are stopping these things. So things like Jimmy Savile parties. Y'all familiar with Jimmy Savile? Yeah, that's a thing that was happening at UK universities when I first joined. Gross, right? This is a really powerful tool for culture change, having this built into policy, because I work with student leaders. And student leaders will be like, hey, Clarissa, just want to ask a question. I'm like, oh yeah, what do you need? Well, we're planning this induction event, and we want to just check with you that it's okay. I'm like, okay, well, what is it? And they're like, well, it's like this Vickers and Hose party. Is that cool? Or like the Pimps and Hose, or like anything on the same theme. And I say, oh, well, that's interesting. Can you tell me why you thought you needed to bring that to me? Why did you want my permission to run that party? And they have to unpick and explain to me why they think that is culturally appropriate, given that we've said that last line there, which then allows them to maybe rethink their induction parties, right? So it is a really helpful thing, because what you can see here is there are some criminal offenses highlighted in this, but there's also some things that are misconduct alone and not going to come under criminal law. This is all students and staff, so we use this for all students and staff, and then we also include domestic abuse for all students and staff. So the definition we use is any incident or pattern of incidences of controlling, coercive, threatening behavior, violence, or abuse between those who are or have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of their sexuality and regardless of their gender. So this is our psychological, emotional, financial, physical, and sexual abuse. We're also going to try to add spiritual abuse to this list in our next policy iteration, because we're seeing that a lot as well. So this covers everyone in the community. We then have additional definitions that cover staff. So staff are already under the definitions you've heard, plus things we know that are happening where people are in positions of power as employees of universities. Misuse of power, inappropriate unwanted behavior, grooming, so that's boundary blurring, okay? Going from professional to personal and grooming someone into a position where they can't say no. Comments and nonverbal communication with sexual content or overtones, creations of inappropriate sexual atmospheres, promised resources in exchange for sexual interaction. These are examples that we see in higher education. If you're interested in learning more about staff sexual misconduct, I highly recommend an organization called the 1752 Group in England. They're a research and lobbying group specifically looking at staff sexual misconduct to students. They're excellent. They put out a lot of really good sector guidance. They've got a chapter in the second book here if you're interested. But what we know is these things are happening, and by naming them in policy and procedure, it acts as a deterrent. If we're not talking about this, if we're not naming it, we're going to allow it to happen. We're going to tell people that it's okay.
Can I just why separate it out that specifically from the general list? So like, I guess it's primarily staff, but would there be that even including it in the full list when there are students that also have power?
That's a great question. So the question was, why have we separated it out for staff? The simple answer is because the staff procedure came later and we had gaps and we added it in. Could you put it in the full policy? Absolutely. But there was for us, there was a point we wanted to highlight that as staff issues, and that procedure came after the full policy was in place. Fantastic question. One of the things I want to highlight before we move on from the definitions is that there's a difference between harassment and misconduct, okay?
So what I mean by that is all harassment is misconduct. Not all misconduct is necessarily harassment. And the reason why I want to highlight this is because as busy people with a lot on our plate, we tend to respond to the things that are the loudest, that are the most distressed, that are the highest risk, and we don't always take the things that are not as serious necessarily, where there hasn't necessarily been harm or trauma. We don't necessarily give it all the time it deserves. But in order for a policy to have integrity and to be meaningful and effective, we have to use it in all cases. So if you think about harassment, harassment is when there is something that's happening for someone where that person feels like they're being harassed, and it's reasonable in that situation for us to see that that's harassment. The behavior in itself might not seem like an issue, so maybe someone's touched me on the shoulder. Is that misconduct alone? Not necessarily. But if they keep doing it, if I've asked them to stop, if they're making me uncomfortable, that can move into harassment, right? And it's not necessarily the intent of the harasser for it to be harassment. So that person might have no intention of harming me, but if they are, that is still a problem. Misconduct, on the other hand, doesn't always have to have a negative impact, okay? So if I'm a lecturer and I walk in here and say, hey, have sex with me and I'll give you great marks, that's misconduct. You might not be traumatized, maybe you are, sorry. You might not be traumatized. I might not have harassed any individual, but promised resources in exchange for sexual interaction. That could have been a joke or banter. That's not okay. Misconduct can be found without harassment being present. And I highlight that for us as policymakers and those who are going to be advocating for this work, because it's so easy to ignore that stuff. But what we know about perpetration is that perpetrators don't start with rape. Okay? They don't start there. They start with inappropriate comments. They start with banter. They start with a light touch on the shoulder. They progress. Most perpetrators, there's different types of perpetration, but the majority of perpetrators in a university setting are the ones who are going to escalate up that scale, starting with what they can get away with, pushing those boundaries of barriers, and moving forward to rape. Okay? Yes?
We've been over and back and using the word misconduct in our policy. So we're working with the Rape Crisis Centre, and they felt very strongly that misconduct sounded like it was a lesser offence, that it shouldn't be in policy, that everything really can come under sexual harassment and sexual violence, and they were advocating very strongly with us not to have the misconduct term used in policy. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. So using the term misconduct, for those of you who couldn't hear, thinking about that actually could lessen, that could potentially minimize people's experiences, and a recommendation not to use that word, but to use harassment and violence only. What I can say is that I have found in the work that I've done at Durham, and this is one location, so take it for what it is, it's an antidote, okay, is that with our students and staff, when I first got hired, we used the terminology sexual violence and misconduct, and the only thing people were reporting were rape and sexual assault. We made a decision, after talking with some students and staff, to switch our terminology to sexual misconduct and violence, and we got a little more, still heavily focused on criminal stuff, but a little more sexual harassment and misconduct reported to us, where people hadn't, so on the misconduct side, where people hadn't been harassed. And so the shifting of how we use that terminology made students, from what we were told by our student body, feel like they could raise things that weren't violent in nature. So we did that as a response to not hearing about any of those cases. We knew they were happening, but no one was coming forward and telling us about them. So that very minor shift made people realize they could bring other things forward. But what I would say is, before making that decision, focus groups with survivors, focus groups with those who have been impacted or who have witnessed misconduct-y type things happen, and hearing what would make you feel able to come forward, what language would be helpful. I personally would like my policy to be more open than saying sexual misconduct and violence, because for stalking, a lot of my students don't realize they can come forward until we educate them about that that's included in the policy. So I think that the best thing to do is have those survivor-centered conversations and see what's going to help people realize they can come forward and talk. But that point about does this minimize it is absolutely valid, because that is a real difficulty. We don't want people to think we just think this is misconduct. Obviously, that's what we can work with in a university, but we don't want to lessen people's experiences. Great question. Up here?
Yeah, just building on that actually, because it is, I would come in from the ETI sector, but I would come in from the specialist sexual violence sector, and that work has been done to build awareness around what sexual violence is for decades and decades, and then it not getting minimised by, because I can see in some of the policy work already that sexual misconduct is becoming an umbrella term, which nearly gave me a conniption when I was looking at coming into it. So it is, I think, where it's appropriately placed. So I think in terms of how we communicate, how survivors, victims, perpetrators, the whole community understand what the nature is, and that we can separate out each piece, as you've been doing today. Yeah. But in the overall space, and I think one of the great things in Ireland now is the CSO have taken the definition sexual violence, and they've now for the first time brought, which is our national data body, a statistical body, and they've taken that to include non-physical offending behaviours. So I think that's a really good shift for Ireland. So I think, it would be, because I think in the US what happened was misconduct came in as a language to kind of separate out Donald Trumps from the locker boys, room talk, and everybody not being in the one category, and that it be swept in so quickly as an umbrella term would be a red flag, I think.
Absolutely. I think that's really helpful to hear. And I think for us, when we're doing this work, we need to be led, and we also need to realize that language evolves over time. So what is helpful today might not be helpful 5 years from now. So we always have to be responsive to shifting in language, because what we don't want is we don't want terms to become euphemisms. Right? That's not what we want. We want them to be meaningful. We want them to be engaging. We want people to understand what we mean. So we need campaign work. We need awareness raising. We need to help people understand the reason we deal with misconduct is because if we don't deal with the perpetrators who are doing misconduct, they're going to go higher. They're going to escalate, right? We want to go down here to prevent escalation higher. That doesn't mean we're ignoring all the other higher stuff that's happening, but also recognizing that, when we talk about violence, sometimes that puts barriers for those who haven't been injured, who haven't seen it themselves as violent, because there's a real internal processing to say, was this violence for me? If it didn't feel like what might look like violence to one another. So really, really helpful discussion, really good ideas and debating that we can think through. If it's all right, I'm going to move us on to a little bit more of the policy stuff, just thinking about time. But I'm hoping you're going to have some more questions. I want to dig deeper into this because that's my aim today, as you know. When we think about misconduct, there are 4 other things that we hold at Durham University in our policy. The first 2 are incredibly rare, and I only know of it happening, one of them happening once since I've been there in 2016. And then the other 2 are incredibly common, but very hard for us to get reports for. So the first one is vexatious reporting. This is a creation of persistent, unwarranted reports. So an example of this might be someone makes a report, we investigate it, we come to a conclusion, and they make the report again. I've actually never used vexatious reporting since 2016. So it's in the policy, I've never used it. It's never come up for us, but we have it in there. The next one down is malicious reporting. This is a false allegation. Someone making a report they know to be untrue. The only time I've had this has happened in the university that we can evidence and say on a balance of probabilities that that's what's happened. It was in a domestic abuse situation where the survivor told the perpetrator, I'm going to report you, so the perpetrator put in a report first. It's the only time I've had it happen. Okay? So, very rare. We know malicious reporting and false allegations are incredibly rare internationally when we look at the statistics. About 2 to 5% if we look at metadata for international statistics for false allegations. And that higher number tends to include when witnesses have been intimidated and withdrawn reports. So it is a very rare circumstance. Can it happen? Yes, of course it can happen. Is it likely to happen? It's pretty low, okay? But we hold it in there, and that way if we need to use it, it's there. Complete complicity, that is much more common. That's any act that knowingly helps, promotes, or encourages any form of sexual violence and misconduct by another individual. For complicity, this might look like I'm a bartender, my friend brings over somebody to the bar, I slip a roofie into that person's drink, I spike their drink, my friend takes that person away and assaults them. Now I am also assaulting that person by spiking their drink, but I'm also complicit in the sexual violence that happened, okay? Another type of complicity that the higher education sector is talking about right now is when staff know of employees who assault students and early career researchers and do nothing about it, which I think is very interesting. And that's not, I heard a rumor, that's I know this is happening and I'm staying silent and I'm allowing it to continue. Retaliation are any words or actions, including intimidation, threats, or coercion, made in response to disclosures or reports. When we inform responding parties, those accused of sexual violence and misconduct of an investigation, we let them know retaliation is not tolerated. So that could be them retaliating against the reporting party or the reporting party's witnesses. That could be their friends or witnesses trying to retaliate against the reporting party. That could be their mom rocking up to the reporting party's accommodation and banging down the door saying, drop the report from my kid. These things happen. Before we were telling students we didn't tolerate that, it happened a lot more. Now, because we have it, we're able to prevent a lot of retaliation. Can it still happen? Yes. It happens a lot less when we communicate at the front what we mean by that. And that includes not only in a letter, telling the student what that is and having it in writing, that's a sit down with me. I sit down with my responding parties and say, this is what I mean by retaliation. If you or your friends or family do this, we will be taking disciplinary action. So we are telling them up front before any opportunity for that happens.
How do you deal with if retaliation happens while you're in the middle of an investigation between the two parties? Does that retaliation become a part of that investigation, or is it separate?
If it's related, we can add it in, and we will tell them. So we'll say we're expanding the scope of the investigation to include this. Yeah, great question.
What have you put in place, or maybe you haven't put in place, to mitigate for the court's process being used against the university for proceeding with investigations in your policy? If there's an reporting party who wants to use the external court mechanisms like injunctions or your right to investigate. Has that come up for you, or?
It has not. Now everyone touch wood, so it doesn't. Yeah, no, we haven't had that problem yet. Usually, if we do have something where there's an external court process, the wider principles of the university procedures would say we would pause something, but that doesn't mean we won't have precautionary measures in place to keep everyone safe if we need to make any pause, but we haven't specifically had to deal with that.
Normally, in a situation like that, a party may actually go, an ex-party application can be made by a party to actually prevent the investigation, for example, happening, and that could be granted, and there would then be time, there would be an allocation time then for a full hearing, and in that period you can do it.
Wow, yeah, so that's very problematic. Yeah.
It's very different law system, I think that is, isn't it?
Yeah, it sounds very different than what we have. You do, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good to know, yeah.
Really helpful. And as I said, I hope this is piquing your interest to dive deeper into all of these intricacies. Ooh, I can't say the word, I've been talking for a while now. Complexities, let's do that. And so you're gonna think about, I hope you didn't want to come here and like, oh, I've got all the answers. I wanted you to see the scope of how big this can be and how much we need to resource this and think about it. This next slide is just a little peek about how we think about procedure. Now, in UK universities, this tends to be the kind of flow of things, and I'm going to come back and unpick this a little bit more. But you tend to have a disclosure where someone says something's happened, then they get their reporting options for support, and they get told they can report to the police or university. And if they choose to make a report, then we hold a risk assessment. Now, obviously, there's some risk assessing we might do before then, but the formal risk assessment happens after a report. Then the police or the university investigate. If the university is investigating, we adjudicate on the case. If appropriate, If misconduct is found, we sanction, and there's usually some kind of appeal or review process available. So this tends to be the flow of how most universities in the UK run things. So I wanted to show you that so you understand the context of what I'm going to share with you in this next section. This is an example of a risk assessment meeting. I wanted to include this because this is one of those really practical things I can share with you, how to conduct a risk assessment meeting that allows you to really support all the parties involved in a case. So this is after the police or university report has been conducted. What we do is, the very first thing at Durham is a case manager is assigned to the case, a specialist case manager. So one of our sexual misconduct and violence case managers, I'm one of them, there's 2 others, and so we've got 3 specialist case managers for any senior staff in the room thinking about resource. We also have 3 professional full-time investigators. So six staff looking at these cases. For those of you, your eyes are wide. But the first thing we do before the risk assessment meeting is we meet with the reporting party and we discuss risk, we discuss safety and support needs, and we confirm that they're happy if it's a university investigation for us to go forward. So even if they submit a report, we don't automatically take action. We have a meeting first to confirm that. Then we hold the risk assessment meeting. No students or parties involved during the meeting. This is a university talking to the university conversation. Specialist case managers in the room, usually someone from counseling mental health is in the room, also representing disability support, someone representing support needs of our reporting party, someone representing the support needs of the responding party who doesn't yet know about the report necessarily. And in that meeting, what we do is we look at the formal report that was made to the police or the university in summary. We don't share the full information with everyone in the room, we just share the relevant information. So we're protective of people's stories and experience. So we pull out the relevant information from the report. We look at support needs of the reporting party, and that can be housing, financial, physical, mental health well-being. That could be academic support needs. That could be career support needs if they're staff. We look at support needs of the responding party. Same thing, a holistic look at that individual, what we know about them. If there's other parties involved, like witnesses or maybe a roommate or housemate that also saw or heard something, we'll think about their support needs so they can be added to the agenda. Then we look at the risk assessment, which is conducted by a specialist case manager. And the risk assessment's not university reputation risk. The risk assessment's about safety. Safety of the reporting party, safety of other students and staff, and the responding party as well. And we use that, so we're looking for things that are high risk. So was this person a stranger? Was use of strangulation? Was there use of a weapon? We're looking at all of those things. Is the reporting party still fearful? Is there ongoing behavior that we're worried about? Where are they going to be on campus in the same space? Where are we going to have these hot zones where people are going to be running into each other? Based on the risk assessment and the support needs, we consider precautionary measures. Precautionary measures are put in place to allow a university or police investigation to go forward. So that at the base is a no contact arrangement where we ask both parties not to contact each other on or off campus, in person or online, or through a third party. Okay? Up from that, we might do bans for the responding party, the person accused, from parts of the university. We might do a partial suspension from parts of the university. We might do a full suspension from the university and pause their academic progress whilst an investigation is ongoing. Okay? We do all of those. If it's staff, we might move someone from a student-facing role and give them other duties. We might say they're not allowed to be with students on their own. They always have to have somebody else with them. We might, very rarely, but it can happen, suspend with pay. Okay? So those precautionary measures are put in place, and then an investigation can begin. And obviously the police investigation will already begin if it's with them, but we let the police know what we're doing in relation to precautionary measures. That's helpful for them to know. So that recommendation, that meeting is what confirms for us that we can investigate and what safety and support measures will be put in place. And that can shift. So if we have a no contact arrangement and a responding party makes contact, we can add that to the investigation, and we can increase the precautionary measure to a partial or full suspension if needed, or suspension with pay for staff. So it allows us to be moving around, and it allows us to be responsive in that place. And the reason why I wanted to highlight this one for you, because I think that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about risk and supporting and preparing for an investigation, but this piece is crucial. This allows us to put support in place for everyone. It allows us to put safety measures in place for everyone. It allows us to show that we are thinking about the wider student community as well, and the wider employee community. And this sets us up for a good investigation. So my students know that I'm going to have this meeting when they put a report in. I let them know what's happening, and I tell them the outcome.
Can I just ask, can you put any of these steps in place if you don't have the formal report? So say if there was an informal report, are you able to implement any of those precautionary measures?
It's a great question. The question is, can we put these measures in place without a formal report? At Durham, it's very difficult for us to do so. We can't put measures in place against a responding party without a formal report. We can do things for the reporting party. So if the reporting party wants to change accommodation, done. We'll do it in a heartbeat. We will find a room. We will put them up. If they're in private accommodation, we'll help ask the Students' Union to help them talk to their landlord because we're not allowed to. And we'll do a whole thing. But we can't do anything with a responding party without having a formal report in place. Some universities, I believe it is Cambridge, they have an informal process where people can request a no contact arrangement. So they can do that, and both parties have to agree to it. But for us, we can't, because we're not set up in that way in our policy. We do have, if someone goes to the police, they don't have to come back through us to get anything. So if they want a no contact arrangement after a police process, instead of going through a university investigation, done, we'll put that in place. And we don't need both parties to agree, we just need one party to agree. And that's usually our reporting party. Good question though.
Sorry, can you just start? You mean with the police if the police is concluded and there's prosecution?
If the police have concluded and the case hasn't gone to conviction, yeah. So if it's ended in no further action, or if it's been acquittal or not guilty, and the student doesn't want us to then take an internal investigation, we can offer that. If it goes to any kind of caution or conviction, then we can go straight to discipline without any investigation. So that's not a problem. Yeah, thank you for asking for that clarification. Okay, so this is just unpicking the procedure a little more, just to show you a little more about what I mean. And we're going to fly through this because I want to talk about training for a moment as well. But let me just show you. So I make a disclosure, and then someone says you can report to the police, you can report to the university, or you can seek support only. If they seek support only, normally that means we cannot take any action with the responding party. Could be different if the responding party is an employee and we feel like there's a safeguarding need that we have to take action, so there could be a little bit of movement. But generally we need consent to tell the responding party that a report's been made against them. And then we can't, if we have one report and we say someone's reported to you, if they have only done something to one person, that's going to identify that person. So we have to be really protective and careful of how we deal with that. But they do have a choice to seek support only, and oftentimes that seek support only and consider your reporting options, because a lot of my students do come back afterwards and make a report later. If they report to the university or police, we hold that risk assessment meeting that I just showed you, okay? So that's always the next step. If it's with the police, then on the student cases, the university investigation's on hold while the police process begins and concludes. If it's with the police and it's a staff case, then we ask the police, can you let us know when we can begin our internal investigation? And that's usually after they've taken statements of all the relevant parties, because we don't want to go and interview someone and then impact a police investigation. So we'll do it after. If it's with the police and it ends in no further action, they can come back to the university. If it ends in not guilty, they can come back to the university. If it never goes to the police, then after that risk assessment meeting, we can begin our university trauma-informed investigation. So we have 3 professional, full-time, trauma-informed investigators hired. We also have a pool of trained investigators, about 30 trained investigators across the university as additional. Our full-time investigators tend to run student cases and complex HR cases. Our volunteer investigators tend to run less complex HR cases. So that's how we currently resource that. That is very different than when I first started, okay? That's an evolved process. I've been there since 2016. So it's taken time to get to that. But what I will say is that we aim to conduct investigations within 90 days. When I used only volunteer investigators, investigations took, on average, 6 months. With professional investigators, we're able to bring that down to that 3-month mark, which is much better for all parties involved. If it's with the police and it ends in no further action, then we can go straight to discipline without any investigation. So If the university investigation on a balance of probabilities, it's more likely than not, the civil standard of proof, cannot find enough evidence for misconduct or finds misconduct did not occur, we would end the case and no further action and go back to both parties separately and ask what support needs they have and what we could do. And usually within that, the investigator makes a recommendation, having spoken to all the parties as to what they think might be helpful as well, and recommends, for example, would you like to have a no contact arrangement? Would you like us to set times when you're in the library and the other person's not? Just to help you guys manage your time on campus. There's a right to request a review, so there's option to challenge that outcome for both parties, but that's usually where we're stopping. If we, on a balanced probabilities, demonstrate there has been misconduct, there has been a breach of policy, then we have our disciplinary action that's taken. And depending on what's happened, we can have a discipline hearing, and we can look all the way up to expulsion from the university or dismissal from the university for staff.
Just to ask you, if there's any other assignment against the respondent, surely the university is doing.
Yeah, so if there's not an adverse finding against the respondent, so they're not found to have committed misconduct, there's a request for review or appeal that's available for both parties here. We can offer no contact arrangements, but anything we do that's on offer when there's no misconduct found, it's mutual. So in other words, if I'm saying, Becky, you can't talk to me and I can't talk to you, and you can't go into libraries on Tuesdays, I can't go into libraries on Wednesdays. And both parties agree. So we work with both parties separately, not in the same room, to say what's going to be helpful for you. And it's led by the students if there's no misconduct. Most students are like desperate for that. They're like, yes, please, get me away from this person. I do not want to have contact. Some students will say, no, we're fine. We don't need no contact arrangements, and we put nothing in place. But that's what we offer. It's a supportive measure, not any kind of sanction at that stage.
And what about the person, the respondent, who there hasn't been a finding of misconduct? You know, it could be tempted to say, look, the righteousness, you know, this has been investigated, there's nothing to see here, I've done nothing wrong, I am not obliged to be, you know, sanctioned or have any limitations put on me.
Yeah, so the question here is, well, what if this person doesn't want limitations because there's nothing that's happened, nothing that's been founded, then it doesn't go forward. So they have to, we can agree a no contact arrangement, so Becky and I don't talk to each other. So we would do a regular no contact arrangement versus if we say, also you can't go to the library, we call that an enhanced no contact arrangement. So the no contact arrangement we can put in place if just one party wants it, but to enhance it, both parties have to sign up for it. Most of our students do. They're pretty fine with that. But it's just led by the students in that case.
And so this is obviously civil, it's within the code of practice policy disciplinary. So a breach of the no contact arrangements.
So a breach of the no contact arrangement could potentially lead to discipline action depending on what the breach is. So for example, if I'm walking in the grocery store, I turn the corner and I bump into Becky and I'm not supposed to speak to Becky, would we discipline for that? No, that's an accident. But if I am following Becky to clubs and coming up to her drunk and talking to her, that could lead to discipline action against me. Yeah, so, and the students know that going ahead. So if they sign up to it, they're signing up to that with that knowledge. Yeah, one more question?
Is there different disciplines for like the basis of the no contact, whereas say in a stalking case compared to a different case, would there be further kind of disciplines if that no contact was broken?
Yeah, so all the discipline is proportionate to what's happened. So we can go from like a letter of reprimand to a ban from certain positions in the university. So maybe someone can't be a president of a club, to bans from parts of the university, to changing college membership because we're collegiate university, to exclusion for 1 year, to permanent expulsion. So we look at what's proportionate to what's happened. And in particular, if, for example, it's a discipline case that was, say, sexual harassment that was founded and a no contact order was placed on the respondent as a sanction, and they breached that, then that could go to a discipline hearing for consideration of expulsion. So that would be enhanced because a finding was already made against them. Great question. So what I'm not doing in today's seminar for the sake of time is walking you through what we do here in a lot of detail. Okay, I'm going to talk about training here in a minute. I'll show you the training that I run about that. But I will say, there's a chapter on investigations and discipline in this book, There's another chapter written by 2 of my investigators on investigations in this book. So I'm showing you places where you can get more information and dive deeper into them, okay? So just so you know where we are. We're going to talk now about prevention and response training. We're going to spend a few minutes on this. This is just a whistle-stop tour of some examples, because I just want to expose you before we finish of what some people can use in organizations and what's helpful and what's unhelpful. So to start this conversation, I want to talk about risk of perpetration. Not risk of being targeted for perpetration, but risk of becoming a perpetrator, okay? We know this is research that looked at Americans, okay, American members of universities, so this is specific to that space, and it's also specific to heterosexual cisgendered men, okay, where this comes from. So this is a specific area of research looking at perpetration to sexual violence. But when they spoke to heterosexual cisgendered men in relation to their engagement at university, when they admitted to engaging in sexual violence, either because they were caught or said in a survey, yes, I did have sex with someone while they were unconscious, okay, which is admitting sexual violence, and then were interviewed. In a lot of different pieces of research, so not just one, but over and over again, we saw these top 5 risks coming up for individual risk of perpetration. So rape myth acceptance, people that believed in rape myths that blame the victim and absolve the perpetrator of guilt. Lack of empathy for rape victim survivors, so not understanding the impact and harm or caring about the impact and harm that could happen. Use of alcohol, not to perpetrate, but personal high use of alcohol. Okay, alcohol doesn't make people perpetrators, okay, but it's connected to risk levels. Hostility toward women, in particular. And hypermasculinity, also sometimes referred to as toxic masculinity. Now, this is a type of masculinity. It does not represent all masculinity, but it's specifically looking at the type of masculinity that has very specific, narrow gendered roles, often associated with hostility towards women, and is connected to high suicide rates in young men, okay? So these 5 things we found as individual risk factors for perpetration of sexual violence at universities specifically. In the community, we find having rape culture embedded in our community increases perpetration. Lad culture, which in the literature sometimes is used synonymously with rape culture, but is slightly different, is highly connected. Lad culture tends to be connected with high use of alcohol, narrow gendered roles, banter, sexualized behavior, right, all of that. Lack of effective deterrence, meaning there's nothing in the community that tells perpetrators you're going to get caught and you shouldn't do this. And lack of guardians, meaning there are no people in the university saying the same thing, okay? So we find this in our communities. So in order for our training and prevention work to be effective, we kind of want to target around these things, because we know these are the things that help sexual violence occur in our communities. So here are 3 different types of training that we can look at. Consent education is really useful. However, I will say consent education does not show that it prevents sexual violence. Okay? Most perpetrators know they don't have consent in universities. That's what the research shows. Consent education is useful because it bridges the gap due to limited sexual education in schools. And when you've got people coming from different countries and different places, it helps people all understand in the same place, this is what we mean by consent. So it raises awareness. It helps increase understanding of how alcohol can impact consent and how to communicate consent and how to see signs of incapacitation. And it also promotes consent culture. So it promotes a conversation that talking about consent and asking for consent is the norm, not the exception. What it really does is it helps the community open a dialogue around sexual violence and consent, and it helps those people who might be survivors recognize when they have the right to come up and say something happened to me, and that it's not just what happens at uni, and that's not just what sex is like. That's what consent education is really for. Active bystander education is really good for prevention, though. Active bystander education targets and challenges social norms and rape myth acceptance. Now, you can put rape myth debunking in consent education, so you can enhance it, and that's really important. But in particular, a lot of active bystander courses specifically are working towards that risk factor there. It helps build empathy and a sense of responsibility, touching another risk factor. When you do consent workshops, people tend to be on the defensive because you're talking about how you communicate around sex and whether people are having sex or not. That can feel kind of uncomfortable. When you're talking about active bystander, you're saying, be a helper, be a hero, go do this, and people can engage in a lot more. Their walls aren't up, right? And so active bystander education is really useful for engagement in this space. It creates guardians in your community, and it helps people identify themselves as part of the solution. I have a purpose here. I have a purpose in this community to help keep people safe and to help create a culture that I want to be part of. And so it's a really useful part of this. Now, with consent education, what I want to say is that there's good consent education and there's bad consent education. Good consent education is going to normalize consent. It is going to challenge people's beliefs. It can be enhanced in a number of ways, and it's going to do so in a way that's not patronizing or patronizing, okay? We want consent education. Don't make me think that I've said don't use it. You need consent education. When I work with my staff and they say, oh yeah, consent's just you have it until you're told otherwise, that's scary. We need people to know about consent, but we also can't use it as the one thing. So universities that like to say, oh yeah, we've got education around sexual violence, TIC, and they only have consent education are missing a piece. You've got to add in the active bystander education if you really want to engage with perpetrators or would-be perpetrators. If you really want to build that empathy, if you really want to help people recognize where they stand in the organization, in the community, in the culture, and create guardians. So you want to add that into the process, okay? Disclosure and response tends to be focused around policy briefings, letting students and staff know what's okay, what's not okay in the community, how to respond to disclosures, how to investigate, adjudicate, and sanction, right? Those are the kind of things that we're doing that helps us deal with the situation. That's not really the prevention side of things. It's still useful because we still need people to know how we're preventing or how we're responding. But the two that are most important in relation to prevention and engagement and a culture change are consent education and active bystander education. This is an example of the training program I run at Durham. Take a little look if you can read all of that. 8 courses for staff, 8 courses for students. And that doesn't include my bespoke courses that I run around study abroad, international students, or anything like that. This is just the main coursework that we do. On the staff side, we do policy briefings that are 30 minutes. We do them in departments during boards of studies. We do them in department team meetings. We go in 30 minutes. Here's our policy. Do you know about it? Do you want to ask any questions? Go on training. Level 1 is my first aid for sexual violence for all staff. Level 2, which you have to do level 1 to get to level 2, is for staff who we expect will receive a disclosure. We have a domestic abuse and stalking awareness and disclosure course, which is really good and brings us lots of disclosures because people go, oh crap, I actually know of a lot of stalking cases now that I realize what that is. And we've had a big increase in learning about those cases because staff just thought people were being a bit romantic and over the top when actually there were some massive red flags around stalking. And the students were coming forward saying, I don't feel safe. It was the staff that were going, oh, you're fine. Right? We've raised that awareness. Trauma-informed investigation, adjudication, and sanctioning for sexual misconduct. That's for my investigators and my discipline decision makers. They have to go on that course to become a volunteer or to become an investigator. They have to do level 1 first before they're allowed onto that course. And my chairs and my discipline panels have to go on that course in order to chair. And then anyone on a discipline panel has to have done level 1 to get on a discipline panel. So at the very least, they have to have that awareness. We have an e-learning course as well on responding to disclosures, understanding confronting sexual harassment and domestic abuse, supporting employees in the workplace. So those are also available to staff. They're not Durham specific, they're general, but the content is still there. For our students, we have Consent Matters, which is Boundaries, Respect, and Positive Intervention e-learning course. So boundaries is around consent, respect is around healthy relationships, and positive intervention is the active bystander module. That is compulsory for every single new starter, undergrad and postgrad at the university. We ask them to complete it at pre-arrival or during the first 2 weeks of term. And so that is that is a really good course for us. We also run consent induction awareness talks in all 17 colleges for all of our first-year undergraduates. So they get a double dose of consent information during induction week if they've done that course that week as well. We have an active bystander course, Durham, which covers consent, coercion, and control, looking at sexual violence and domestic abuse specifically. This, responding to disclosures of sexual violence for student leaders, is first aid for sexual violence for students, how to take a disclosure from a peer. We also run peer-facilitated consent workshops. And then this consent workshop, Train the Trainer, and active bystander, Train the Trainer, that's also peer-facilitated. That's where we train up our facilitator students. So they run the courses. Our active bystander course is paid facilitators because it's a bigger course. The consent workshops are volunteer facilitators at the moment. And then we have this same e-learning course that's available for staff, opened up to students as well. So I know that's a lot, and especially those of you who are just starting this work are going to go, what? Let's see what you have.
Do you have a difference between, say, is there elements of this that's mandatory for staff and students? I mean, obviously not all. Some is applicable to those on your investigators or your chairing panels as well. But is there a difference between mandatory and voluntary?
Great question. Is there a difference between mandatory and voluntary on this training? So all students compulsory for this course, undergrad and postgrad. All undergrads are expected to attend this, although we don't police it, but it's first week, so they don't know that they can say no, so they mostly show up. All of our freshers reps, our FREPs, are asked to attend that course in order to be a FREP during Freshers Week, okay? So that's usually about 500 students that do that course in September. This is asked of all of our welfare reps in any society in the university, and all of the presidents of clubs and everything are asked to go on that, and it's dependent on the college and the group whether or not it's compulsory for them. This is done out of 17 colleges, only 9 of the colleges do this, and of those, 2 of them make it compulsory for all of their first years, and they run it during a consent campaign week where they get all the first years in during the first term, usually in November, to add into these 2. These are compulsory for our facilitators, and then this is just available. For our staff, those who are in student support positions are expected to complete these 3 courses. So we have new student support officers in every academic department. I've just trained all of them in May. They've all completed that course. So it depends. This is for our investigators required. And then everything else, it depends on the department. So I have some departments that require level 1 for all staff and postgraduate research students. I have some that don't. So policy briefing is not compulsory, but it's recommended. Yeah, you're welcome.
I'm just interested in active bystander for staff, because earlier we talked about staff maybe being complicit.
Yes.
Why is that on your list?
So they have an online active bystander course that is not specific just to sexual violence. So it's run by our EDI staff team. So I haven't included it on the list because it's not in my training program specifically, but they do have an active bystander course as well. Yes. Was there one over here, Kate?
Yeah, just a question for the non-compulsory ones. Do you offer any incentives like certificates or anything like that?
No, we don't. So the non-compulsory ones, it is based on kind of student motivation and staff motivation to attend. Yeah, so we don't have that built in. But there are universities that do this really well with incentives, like providing raffles for like an iPad, all kinds of things like that. We just haven't done that yet at Durham.
And do you require registration beforehand for, say, the consent workshops?
Yeah, so we've got a way for them to sign up so we can have a record of who's gone and everything. Yeah, great questions. Okay, we're coming towards the end and we'll have a few more minutes for questions, but I just want to say some final points, get through these last 3 slides and then I'll open it up. This is difficult work, okay? It's really important, it's necessary, and it's worth it. I hope that by showing you the scope and how big this can be, I haven't scared you away from the work, but I've been motivated you, encouraged you of the importance of it. It's really, really important that we embed ethical and safe practice into this work. What I often say to the team is that we're not going to do the easy thing, we're going to do the right thing. And that can be hard. But we need to do that. It's really, really important. It's really important that you put training in place for your employees appropriate to their roles. What you don't want to do is run a campaign saying, tell the university if you've been hurt and we'll help you, and then not train your staff. Because if you tell students and staff they can come forward, they'll start to come forward. And if you're not prepared to receive them, you're going to harm them, and you're also going to immediately undermine your credibility. So it's really important that training's in place. I highly encourage, and I'm going to ask if Rape Crisis is here if they agree with me, I highly encourage you working with your local Rape Crisis or other relevant charity to develop and or deliver your training. Okay? Pay them to do it. They don't work for free. But use them. They are the experts. You don't have to have the expertise in-house to do this work well. Partnerships is important and necessary. And you have to engage self-care in this work. Okay? I don't care if you're a policy person, I don't care if you're a secretary who just takes minutes of meetings, you need to have some safe self-care embedded. At the university where I am, we have access to clinical supervision for some of the case managers who are social workers like myself. We have reflective practice available where our staff can meet with a counselor who's external to the university. We open that up to our admin team. Anyone who's dealing with sexual violence has that available to them, so to get that support and to get that help. Because if we don't do that, we're going to be subject to vicarious trauma, secondary trauma. We're going to burn out. We're not going to be able to help anyone, and we're going to end up just quitting and moving, changing careers, which is sometimes so tempting. We've got to practice self-care. So what I'm going to ask you to do today is I'm going to ask you each individually to choose one healthy coping skill that you're going to practice tonight before you go to sleep. You don't have to say it out loud, but can I just give you a moment to sit there, reflect, and then when you're ready, just give me a little thumbs up, and we'll move on to Q&A. Okay, so I want to thank you for your attention. These are some suggested readings that I have for you today for some books that I think are really good. Two of them are mine, so I'm a bit biased. But I'll let you, you'll get these slides as well, so don't worry about that. You'll get these. Really encourage you to look through these. For my two books, let me just say that the proceeds for this book go to the Rape and Sexual Abuse Counseling Center of County Durham and Darlington. For this book, they go to Refuge, which is our domestic abuse charity in England that runs our helpline for domestic abuse. And the first one is an authored book with practical guides and templates that you can copy and use. The second book is an edited volume. It talks about policy and procedure, context and law. It talks about practice, and it talks about partnerships. There's a really good chapter in there by Rape Crisis Scotland that I encourage you to read through, but really want you to dive deeper into this area if you're interested. And at the very least, because the money goes to a good cause, if you don't like it, it's a good paperweight. So with that, we have about 12 minutes for Q&A and also the raffle draw, maybe. Make sure your name's on it. Any burning questions that you absolutely want to ask?
Firstly, I just want to say that it's important to acknowledge the value of all of this work that was contributed across the sector as well. And just to acknowledge, you talked about how it does need a lot of self-care. I'm sure it's not easy, that journey, especially for outline. So reflecting back to 2016, you've outlined a really comprehensive infrastructure, very complex, really, I suppose, thorough in terms of thinking through all of the component parts in terms of the care for the complainants, the respondents, those who are investigating. So that is so, I suppose, in-depth. So you really built that very in-depth capacity, I suppose. How did you get that? And I know it wasn't overnight, I'm sure it was a journey, but how did you get that buy-in from the university to support that journey and that institution?
Absolutely. So how did I get the buy-in to develop something as robust as we are at? And I still am like, oh my gosh, we have so much work to do. If I look back, I feel like we've made loads of progress. If I look forward or present into forward, I feel like we've got so much we need to accomplish. I was lucky in that at Durham, we had a sexual violence task force for a year who created my job. To get that sexual violence task force, there were situations where survivors came forward and the university couldn't help them, so the survivors left. There were student activists who were advocating for the university to do better, and there were academics who were saying, this isn't good enough. So there was that kind of combination of things that led the university to reflect on what was going on. And then we had senior leader buy-in and had to maintain good relationships with senior leaders. In this book, I have a book on resistance, how universities can resist this work. It talks about 8 different types of resistance and how they can do it at an institutional level, an individual level, and how they can use it directly against victim survivors. That book demonstrates some of the challenges I have faced over the years and explains a little bit about how I accomplished getting around some of them, and some of them I've yet to fix. But what I will say is that relationships is so important. So when I didn't have a good relationship with a senior leader and I needed something, I'd go to my students' union and be like, hey, any of your student reps or any of the staff here friends with this person? Can you go talk to them? Can you go get into their ear? Because I'm never going to get into the door. So it was about building that network and really taking almost a lobbying approach to get people to hear it, and using networks and champions to have those conversations. But if you don't have senior leader buy-in, using student leaders to help get buy-in, because the thing about students is that they come and go, and it's easy to appease them and say, oh yeah, we'll deal with that, we'll get to that, and then they go away, and then, oh, we can suddenly forget that we said we were going to do that thing. But having student leaders who are empowered to really challenge and advocate and be activists in the space can be a really useful tool. And I work with every year I get with my student leaders at the start of the year and say, okay, what are your goals this year? Here are my goals. Where do these align? Can we work together? I'm not going to get that, but you can challenge me on that. That's cool. Do that outside of this room, and let's see where we can get to it. So really having those conversations and working together. Yeah, I'm here, and here.
You mentioned that it's really important to bring inspirers into influence and contribute to policy. I'm just wondering how you do that.
Ooh.
How did you manage to do that?
Chapter in here by Jim. Let me see who's first on this one, actually. Sunday Blake and Jim Dickinson, How to Involve Students and Work on Gender-Based Violence. I'm going to answer by signposting to that chapter because they talk about how to do it in a way that doesn't exploit students. So my short answer might not be comprehensive enough to say how to do it well. They really comprehensively answer that question. So I'll come back. What we have here?
Just earlier in the first half, you mentioned on the slides about how sanctions should be proportionate. And I'm wondering, what factors do you consider in terms of what is proportionate?
Yes, in this book here, it's my quick answer so I can get all of you. There's a chapter on discipline here. It talks about mitigating factors, aggravating factors, and compounding factors that might move you up and down a discipline sanctioning scale, but also where to begin the scale. So what's proportionate to the offense itself, and then how do you go up and down within the individual nature of that case itself. So that's like chapter 8, I think, something like that.
So is that primarily based off the acting instead of being reported, or the impact on the...
All of it.
All of
Yeah. Once you have identified that there has been misconduct, then you can look at the whole thing to decide what's appropriate. Yeah, great question.
Sorry, you have a long question. But say during your coaching or during your reporting process, are there support services that exist for perpetrators that say they're not but say, because there's an example of huge thing, right? Like someone, well, people don't walk around considering themselves rapists or stalkers, so they're never going to see their actions within that lens. So say someone's, whether they've been kind of found guilty or not, but there's no university, are there any services that are there to support them to challenge their behavior in a way that will, there's actual intervention there, as opposed to someone where I feel like that was so unjust or...
Yeah.
So the question is there support for people who've been found to be perpetrators to challenge their behavior? And what I'll say is there's not external charities in my local area in the northeast of England that do that without police involvement. There is a national charity that particularly helps people who might use extreme pornography to lessen their use of that and potentially escalating into other things that are illegal as well. So people who have the willingness to engage with that, there are some things nationally. And then within someone maybe who doesn't recognize their behavior is not okay, if they're staying on campus with us, we sometimes add in reflective things, educational sanctions as well. So we might ask them to attend or complete some kind of training and then write a paper for us about what they learned about their own behavior. So we do try to put some intervention in for things like sexual harassment, where we don't want them to escalate into something that might be more violent. Yeah, great question. I have one back here, and then I'll get you, the two of you.
Yeah, great. So I actually have 5, and I'm going to ask you one.
Thank you. Sorry.
In terms of the culture change normative, changing that normative, traditional harmful normative space, engaging silent majorities, particularly within the male population, have you progressed work on that within your community in Durham? Like, have you done work to get men more active in control?
We've done that more specifically with our sports teams, our male sports teams, and so we've had some student leaders in relation to our captains of teams who have progressed that, and also we provide a different training program for the sports teams. So we bring in a training place called Beyond Equality that used to be called the Good Lad Initiative. They come and do some very targeted training with them and about leadership and about challenging rape culture as well. They're a great organization based, I think, out of Oxford or Cambridge, I forget which one. But yeah, so we do stuff with that. There's also, from the academic side, Dr. Stephen Burrell, who does some work about engaging men in this area to be allies and to actually change culture. So he's at Durham University. There's a man named Michael Flood in Australia who also specifically looks at that, who's really good. So yeah, predominantly at Durham, it's with sports teams. I'm gonna take 2 last quick questions, and then or maybe one, then I have to stop because y'all have a launch to do next. So was it here?
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's an ongoing investigation, do you ever take a multi-agency approach, so like working with the police or with like organizations like Colin and say if it's a solvable case?
Yes, we always engage our partners where appropriate and where we have consent and partnerships to do so.
Does GDPR get in the way of that, or?
In some cases, no, because we'll have partnerships where we have data sharing agreements already, and if not, we work with, we have consent from the party, and then we don't share the details of other parties. Yeah. Last question here.
Thanks so much. I was just going to ask you, because you mentioned about how hard it is to measure prevention, and if you're doing anything on that in Durham, because I think it's an important way to try and increase the support that we have for the work.
Yes.
That's a big question.
So a very short answer is that a campus climate survey to measure prevalence rates instead of knowing your reported data, which was disclosed or reported to you, is the best way to do that, and then to do that annually or at least every other year so that you can see if your prevalence rates change. Lots of information in both of those books about that. Have yet to accomplish that at Durham. I know it works, I can tell you how to do it, but I haven't been able to get it done. The Office for Students is trying to do a national campus climate survey, though, in England, so we're hopefully going to be able to engage with that if possible. I want to very quickly thank you for all of your questions, your engagement today. We have an opportunity, I don't know how we're going to do it, to pull at least 2 names for these books. Oh, fantastic. Do you want to say their names?
So between myself and Margaret, we did a really official Google number between 1 and 46. So the first book, whichever one you want to pick there, Teresa, is for 41, and that was Sarah O'Lady. Well done. And the second book is number 14, Karen. She's off, yeah.
All right, I just want to thank you all so very much. I've had a lovely time with you. I hope this has been beneficial, and I hope you've got lots of questions, but also a lot of practical information you can go away with. And I'm going to hand it over now to you.
Clarissa, for your expertise and time here today. My specific duty now is try to get you not to leave. So what we're going to do, I mean, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Yeah, 3 o'clock on Friday, like let's launch our program. But we had the launch of our program, 5-year program yesterday in Dublin. And then obviously University of Bow is our home institution, and we've got many wonderful guests and friends with us today. So we hoped, some people would stay for the while. What we're going to do first is just do some photos out in the lobby. So I know, Becky, we were thinking about like the different groups of colleagues who are with us today, and maybe we could organise that. We have the university president outside as well, so I'm keen to get out there and get the ball rolling. Then what we'll do is come back in, and then we will keep our launch as brief as possible. I know the President wants to say a few words, because University here has been really supportive of our work over the past number of years. And then we will judge the room, Siobhan.
Yeah, I'm very sure.
Yeah. And also our wonderful colleague Kathy Connolly from Galway Rape Crisis Centre did such a great job yesterday. Some of you were there, but there's not such an overlap. So I think we'll do the same. We're just going to reprise a shorter version of that. We really appreciate it if you could stick around. Understand if you can't transport on a Friday, but and congratulations and thank you, Clarissa. Hopefully for the beginning